or not. So welcome to our panel. We have a lot of really notable speakers with us today. In fact, I think all of our speakers are notable in their own way. I would like to start by thanking everyone who's joined us today, both our speakers and our guests who've come to hear what I think is, one of the most important things we can be addressing as journalists at the moment and as journalism educators. I need to also thank UNESCO and the World Journalism Education Council, who offered us the opportunity at the start of this year to host a roundtable where we address some of the issues that we feel are important to the future of both journalism and journalism education. So thank you to UNESCO and the WJEC for their support in helping to stage this event. So what we wanted to focus on here in the UK is to talk about the reporting of the climate crisis. And given that we have just staged COP26 here in the UK, to ask our colleagues, particularly those who reported on it, to reflect on whether or not that was a success. It seems from the outside that there were some limited successes and there were some questionable outcomes, the failure to raise the climate funding for the countries who are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. I think we probably would all agree that the phrase phased down is now going to be corporatised in lots of different ways and used by lots of different managers to explain lots of different decisions. And really, I suppose, do we think that COP26 did enough to keep that whole notion of 1.5 alive, which we know was really important to huge parts of the world, in fact, to all of us. I think the thing that struck me most at COP26 was, the planet will survive the climate crisis. I think it's the species of human beings that possibly might not. And that resonated with me every single time I stepped out my front door, because I do literally live about 10 minutes walk from where the event happened. So what I've put on the slides there is just how this afternoon is going to unfold. So we have quite a lot of speakers, and again, thank you so much for joining us. And we've had a lot of people sign up for the event. So hopefully I know that people will pop in and out. We also have the editor of our journal, Journalism Education, Professor Chris Frost, who just wants to grab a few words towards the end to just ask people for papers. And Professor Simon Cottle from Cardiff University, who's proposing to put together a book, and Simon also would like a few minutes to tell you that. So that's in addition to our speakers. I'm going to kick off and start. Our first session will be really each of our speakers will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have a chance to ask some questions, make some comments. Our speakers variously will share slides or won't, whatever they feel they most want to do. And I'm going to start with, and we will try and keep to the running order we had agreed, but if people are not here or aren't ready to present, or indeed need to present earlier, we will try and accommodate that. But I'm going to start with Matt McGrath, who's probably someone that most of us are familiar with. Matt's the BBC's environment correspondent, and he's been reporting on the environment since 2007. And has won a number of awards. And I think he's probably shared a lot of the really important stuff with us. So Matt, if I can just pass over to you.
Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, thanks everybody. It's good to be here. I guess like everybody else, I'm still reeling from what went on in Glasgow. Not just the fact that there was sunshine in Glasgow, which there obviously is today as well. It was actually quite a sunny event, but I'm still trying to process really, and I think we probably all are in this kind of same boat on that. Yeah, it was in many ways a very bruising experience. It was very tough. It was very hard to cover. I think it was probably the hardest news event I've ever reported on, and there's a number of reasons for that, which I'll expand on in a bit. But it was a real challenge, and coming back down to earth since then has been difficult as well. You might notice in the corner of my room over here, I've got a number of brown boxes of English sparkling wine. I just want to reassure you that I've not been taking refuge in the dreaded drink as a way of coping, although I've been very tempted. So I just got a few things, a few reflections really on what happened and what went on there, and how it played out in terms of the nature of the job that we do as journalists and reporters. I mean, I think the first thing really was the sheer sense of scale, the information overload, the huge number of not just emails, but numbers of WhatsApp groups, briefings, the amount of just processing your mind had to do to get around all of it, and everybody scrambling around to try and understand what was the story, what is the story all the time. And people I know from my colleagues who were a little bit further away, having this, they had this terrible fear of missing out, this fear of not being in possession of all the facts, when in fact we were all in the same boat. And so I think there's quite a vulnerability there in terms of our ability to be manipulated, to be steered, if you like, by whomever the people in power are. I think one of the other things that I'd reflect on really would be the changing nature of the coverage on climate from the BBC. I know some of people might say, well, we're a little late to the party on that, and perhaps that might be somewhat true, but I suppose better late than never would be my touch on that. I think for people who might have seen it, we mounted a live page coverage from just before the start to all the way through till the day afterwards. We had reporters on the ground, obviously. We had a lot of features, a lot of feature material, which was something slightly strange for us. We did much of the news writing came out of London, and the analysis was based in Glasgow. So that was a different change for us. In some ways, it allowed there were pros and cons to that, I would say. But it's certainly, in terms of an event, I think the BBC really tried to get to grips with it and to leave no stone unturned, really, in terms of the way that we covered it. I think it was interesting, and it came up a number of times in different discussions, and it may be true for my other colleagues as well, was the impact and the influence of political reporting on this. I know that there were some people in the media, my former colleague Richard Black amongst them, who felt there was a danger that once political reporters got involved in the process, they wouldn't have enough knowledge or enough perspective to be able to report the story correctly. And, again, I think that's open to debate on that. I think, for many of the political reporters that I spoke to, they had made significant efforts to get up to speed with a very complex issue. And I think most of them, in fairness, had managed to do that. I think one of the big changes that I would observe in reporting this over a number of years is the changing nature of wire agencies and the changing nature of the way news happens in relation to a big event like this. Once upon a time, maybe a decade ago, we looked to the wire agencies to set the bar on what was happening, to define for us in some ways what was happening. But that role has really changed, and I don't think it's quite as true anymore. I think we're seeing, through the use of social media, through direct communications from governments, via email, via phone call, whatever else, that there's a much different agenda being set. And again, because of the sheer volume of information, I feel we're kind of vulnerable, or journalists are vulnerable to a range of manipulations and in a way that perhaps we haven't been before. I think, there, in terms of the actual story, in terms of the nature of where we are at the end of it, I think one of the things I would take from it is that we really don't really know what actually happened there yet. I think we're still all processing the nature of what we saw there, particularly on the last day. I think the bruising nature of the naked political power of China and India in some respects, and the vulnerability and impotence of many small island states and countries was really interesting to see as a kind of a geopolitical act played out in front of our eyes. So I think we're all still trying to get to grips with what really the Glasgow Climate Pact really means, and how is it going to play out when we go to Sharm el-Sheikh next year and the UAE the year after, and who's going to drive, where are the where are the forces of progress going to be in this scenario? So I think there's an awful lot to unpick, and I think as we go forward, it'll be interesting to see what people make of it. I think our perspective, my personal perspective, is that I'm glad it's over. It became a matter of survival at the end, and it was but an overwhelmingly difficult, engaging, powerful story, the like of which I've not seen before or dealt with before, a lot to learn from it as well, and from the way that we covered it, indeed, both pros and cons. So I'll leave it with you there at that point, and I'm happy to take questions at whenever you're ready to do that.
Thank you. Really, really interesting points you made. I spoke to a professor of environmental politics who has been an advisor and an expert author to the IPCC, and he has attended every single COP. And he was saying to me that the nation that challenges the most is the Saudis. And I had met him, I think, on the second day of COP26, and he says, his experience was that things really get held up and it's really bureaucratic, and that the country that holds things up. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And then, of course, as we went through, that also became apparent, because that became a story as well, that as well as China and India exerting huge influence, so were the Saudis. And I thought that was quite an interesting narrative that really I had never heard before. And then all of a sudden, someone's telling me this, and then actually the story appeared, I think, about a week later, that this was also slowing down the negotiations. I think also that sense as well of just the negotiations just take so long, and really are not dealing with the big headlines that as news consumers people want to hear, and as journalists we want to tell, but that are really dealing with small detail and phrases and words, and how we understand and interpret them. So it was fascinating from that point of view as well. I think that, as you say, there were a lot of different stories going on there, and that possibility of manipulating.
Yeah, there's a real disconnect, as we know, between what's going on inside and what's going on outside, and the hopes and expectations of the world generally, or we're going to deal with climate change here, with the argument over the full stops, the commas, and the nature of phase down or phase out, as it might be. So there's that's a perennial thing that we face, I think, every year in trying to report this, that what people understand as to what and to what it really is.
Could I just, thanks very much, Matt. Can I just ask that everyone who isn't speaking mutes their mics, because we are getting some noise coming through. So if people could do that, we would appreciate that. Thank you so much. Can I go next, and not in keeping with our running order, unfortunately, to Leo Hickman. Leo, I think I did see you on the...
Yeah, hi, Margaret.
You're here. Thank you, Leo. Can I just introduce Leo Hickman? Now, Leo is probably familiar to lots of people because Leo was a journalist at The Guardian, but is now the editor and director of Carbon Brief, and has written a number of books as well. The one that I think sounds the most interesting, and I'd love to know more about, but perhaps not today because time is precious, is Will Jellyfish Rule the World, which I think has to be one of the best titles I've heard. Leo, thank you so much for joining us. You obviously have a perspective as well, because I know you were at COP26 because I saw you tweeting lots about it. So can I hand over to you? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Margaret. And thank you for this opportunity. And just to follow on from what Matt was saying, it's quite boring, but I pretty much agree with everything that Matt has just said about the observations about just how challenging this COP was to cover as a journalist compared to previous COPs. It was a very unique and a very different COP, and I suspect we won't ever get a COP like that again. That's my feeling. There was a sort of uniqueness in the fact that the UK was hosting it, and obviously, and I think that brought some sort of interesting dynamics to the party, which we can sort of unpack a little bit if we want to. But just in terms of my reflection on how it went, I agree with Matt, obviously, that we're all absolutely physically and mentally exhausted by it still, to be honest. And I agree that the dust hasn't really quite settled yet on the outcome and what it means beyond the kind of the headlines. And I mean, from my perspective, it was interesting watching that phase down, phase out kind of, you know, wordplay right at the end and all the geopolitics that were going on around that. I actually sort of found that in you know, once we've kind of moved on from it for a few days, actually that's not so significant in terms of the actual wider outcome. I think the word coal being in agreement for the first time is a big deal. And I think that opens the door now to sort of no doubt incremental and iterative kind of wordplay going on in future COPs where new adjectives and verbs and nouns get fought over. But I do feel it has sort of opened the door. And I think it doesn't really matter, to be honest, whether it said phase down or phase, you know, phase out. I think that's, in the grand scheme of things, kind of irrelevant. You know, not least because the Chinese had already said earlier in the year a few times that that was a language they were happy with. So it was probably going to go that way anyway. In terms of actually being a journalist there, I mean, I was there with the team from Carbon Brief, and we had quite a big team, much bigger than we've ever had before, and which brought many opportunities, also some challenges in terms of having a great team with many kind of great specialist colleagues there covering different angles. You know, we had people following the China delegation, people following the kind of land use and food and deforestation kind of thematic. We had people following, as we always do, very closely, the kind of line by line, square bracket by square bracket kind of negotiations that go on. But I think we come at it from a very different place than where Matt and where other people on this panel come at it. You know, and we're not closely following the news cycle and the hourly sort of daily news cycle. We intentionally go to COPs to produce a kind of huge omnibus piece at the end of COP within a sort of day or two of it concluding, which we did. And it was a very grueling last weekend to get that piece done in time to publish it. And it ended up being about 20,000 words, which to most people was completely insane from a kind of journalistic point of view. No, you would never think that was a great idea, but actually it's done enormous traffic for us, that piece. And there was a lot of people at COP saying to us, oh, we'll just wait for the Carbon Brief piece, you know, and it puts a bit of pressure on us, obviously, but there's a lot of expectation now that we will produce this kind of huge summary piece. Which we did, and we're very pleased with it. But it takes a particular kind of approach to the COP, because the COPs are traditionally split into sort of week 1 and week 2 with a particular thematics and focus being not so political in week 1. It's more about the scientists presenting sectoral kind of announcements, etc. And then week 2 moves into the sort of hard politics when all the ministers arrive. But I think from my perspective, personally, as a journalist being there, I think COP26 will be memorable for me for being a COP, particularly around the sectoral announcements. I think it was some of the announcements around forestry, and, you know, it goes back to the Boris Johnson kind of slogan of coal, cars, cash. I don't even want to say it. I've heard that phrase too many times now. But you know what I mean? That it was that kind of week 1 kind of, you know, avalanche of announcements, which was very challenging, and must have been really challenging for news journalists to cover every twist and turn, and all of the competing interpretation of what those actual pledges meant. And there was an awful lot of spin going on, not least from number 10, about what, you know, how fantastic or otherwise those particular pledges were, and which country was in, which country was out. And I think, to be honest, even the dust hasn't really settled on some of that yet about exactly who signed up to what. But I think in terms of COP26 being remembered for something beyond the phase out, phase down coal kind of headline that many people kind of inevitably kind of captured in those final hours, I think it will be remembered for a COP now moving up a gear in terms of sectoral specificity, if that makes sense. You know, going in at methane, going in at forest, going in at coal, going in at cars and things, which are all absolutely vital, you know, for the wider Paris Agreement goals. But I don't really remember COPs particularly being so focused on some of that in terms of some of the key outcomes. yeah, just sort of finally, just to sort of reinforce that point that Carbon Brief is a kind of a niche and specialist player in this kind of wide landscape of journalists. You know, there were 3,000 journalists who were registered at COP26, and highest number ever. And it was very noticeable being in the media zone, just how many first-time kind of COP journalists there were, which brought, you know, particular the first COP for anyone, whether you're a delegate or a journalist, is incredibly challenging, especially if you're a solo journalist working, you're the sole representative for, you know, for that publication or that outlet. And I think, to go back to Matt's point, I think there's increasing need these days for a lot of journalists. And as the climate journalism kind of volume increases in terms of commitments and budgets and things that people are spending on this around the world, I think there is kind of going to be a need for, to some degree, a bit of hand-holding and help. And that creates problems as well, as Matt alluded to, like who is holding your hand, who is helping you kind of triangulate and understand all this kind of fire hose of news and information and spin. But yeah, I think, you know, more broadly, it's fantastic that we're having this discussion so close to COP, I think, with all the journalists and journalistic kind of academics around this, because I think it's important to analyze this moment right now while it feels kind of red hot and it's right still in our focus. And I think, you know, in the next 6 months, you know, to a year, as we move on to Egypt, I think it will be crucial to now see how different publications that committed to climate coverage in the last year, particularly the UK ones, you know, we had campaigns launched by the Times, the Sun, the Express, you know, I think it was only really the Telegraph and the Mail maybe that didn't really join that party. What happens now with the international spotlight not on the UK and the shift towards more domestic issues around gas boilers and energy prices and net zero policies? What happens now in terms of those editors' commitments, both in terms of editorial commitments and budgets? Does that fall off a cliff? Hopefully it doesn't, but what does that momentum and body of journalism do now that the COP is over? But hopefully we can discuss that a bit more, but I'll leave it there because I know we've got lots of great speakers to come.
Great, thank you, Leo. Really interesting comments, I think, around the commitment of news organisations and the news media to telling the story. I was struck, actually. I'd attended an event at the New York Times Hub where they stood up and said, you know, they had something like 12 reporters on their climate desk, which to me, I was shocked by how few that was when you think it's a news organisation the size of the New York Times, although they did make a commitment there that they were going to increase that. So that will be interesting. But certainly I think that for our students, obviously, that's something to be thinking about for the future. What are the potential opportunities that will exist in terms of reporting? But thank you, really interesting perspective. Can we move on now to Nathan Farrell, who is going to bring us a different perspective. Nathan is the Research and Monitoring Deputy Director of Sustrans. And Nathan is also a former academic because he worked with our fabulous colleague Anne Luce at Bournemouth University. Nathan, I think you are on the call because I could see your name. If you want to just take it away and tell us what the perspectives of an organisation like Sustrans are in terms of reporting the crisis and the climate and even on COP26.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for inviting me here today. I'm going to attempt to share a PowerPoint slide, so everybody just wait in awkward silence while I try and get this to work.
Somebody can sing a song. Yeah, it's working okay. Thanks, Nathan.
Perfect. Well, yeah, as I said, thank you for inviting me here today. My name is Nathan Farrell. I'm the Head of Research and Monitoring for Sustrans in Scotland and Northern Ireland. I thought I'd use the time I have today just to talk a little bit about Sustrans and our work in promoting sustainable and active travel and the links between transport and climate change more broadly, our work with communities and reflections on certainly the reporting of COP26, but also the reporting of climate change more broadly. So to start off with a charity that makes it easy for people to walk and cycle. So my focus is largely on transport, and that might seem of little significance in the kind of broad global scope of the impending climate chaos. But it's worth bearing in mind that transport is the largest sector in terms of emitting greenhouse gases in the UK. In 2019, domestic transport was responsible for emitting 122 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, and that's about 27% of the UK's total emissions. And that 2019 figure, which was published this year, is a 1.8% reduction on emissions from 2018. And in those 2019 figures are only 3% down on the total from 2009. So not enough is being done, and we do kind of need to move more decisively on that immediately. And that involves rethinking at a systemic level how transport works and the choices we make when we want to move, and how we can rethinking how we can make cleaner, greener, and more inclusive transport future. So our goal is a society where the way we travel creates healthier places and happier lives for everyone. And Sustrans began in the 1970s in the shadow of the oil crisis, and 40 odd years later we find ourselves in another crisis not unrelated to fossil fuel use, and was formed when a group of a community of cyclists and environmentalists were mobilized by concerns on our over-reliance on cars and environmental damage that causes. And our focus is very much on communities, and communities are at the heart of what we do, working with schools, working with different communities to rethink, help them rethink their places and rethink the role of individuals and communities in shaping better ways to move together. In my experience, it's often community-based ground-up projects that show the greatest potential for rethinking how we organize neighborhoods, spaces, in such ways that connect us to ourselves, to each other, and to our places. We know that private cars and our reliance upon them not only has a devastating environmental impacts, but also acts to isolate us in small metal boxes. The study by Donald Appleyard in early 1980s, it's classic and often cited and subsequently built upon. Someone's getting a call. Posits a very strong link between heavy traffic and social isolation. The lines on the diagram representing movements of people in a community to come together and socialize, and that is impacted greatly by heavier traffic. And while individual choices we make to reduce our carbon footprint might be small, the collective impact is more noticeable and has more potential. And I think it's through community action that we can come together, not only to mitigate some of the impacts of climate change, but as is increasingly more likely to support each other through the unfolding climate chaos. It was our own observations, it was largely reported that electric vehicles were represented rather routinely as a technological fix, and electric vehicles are not really the solution, and rising traffic is spoiling where we live. And we know that traffic is bad for us, our health and our communities, and that's something that has to change. And it's something that a majority of the public agree with as well, and that our towns and cities are organized more for cars than for people. So it's really something at a community and city level that we ought to think about reorganizing those structures around infrastructure, and using that as an inspiration to demonstrate the types of systemic change that can be organized elsewhere. My own reflections on COP26 in the media and climate change more broadly, and these are kind of more my own reflections rather than Sustrans as an organization, is that the summit and climate change more broadly is one in which the media, which is the corporate media, rarely, as far as I could see, strays from the narratives that are provided by centers of state and corporate power. And that's quite understandable. If you look at the political economy of the media industry and its reliance on advertising revenue, it's not surprising to see discussions of climate change alongside advertisement for low-cost airlines or gas guzzling SUVs, and that was still observed in the press throughout the summit, unironically. And it's not surprising to see that reliance on the narrative of political leaders, the speeches they make on climate change, and the more generally, and at events like COP, as many of our prestigious journalists socialize in the same circles as our political and industrial leaders. And the result is coverage of climate change, from my observations, that brackets it off from other world affairs. That gap is closing and those brackets are dissolving, but they're still very much there. And we can see this in coverage of former US President Barack Obama's speech at COP, which few journalists link to his commitment to extracting fossil fuels during his presidency and expansion of pipeline networks to that effect. Few mentioned the military is one of the largest producers of greenhouse gases. That seemed to be largely off the agenda in much of the press coverage that I saw. And more broadly, coverage of freak environmental phenomena, which occurs more greatly and with greater regularity, are largely also isolated from these trends. So the hottest days on record are generally reported alongside pictures of people at the beach or children enjoying ice creams. And solutions, from my own observations, tend to be presented in the form of quick technological fixes, consumer goods such as electric vehicles, which still produce a lot of particulate matter pollution in forms from the braking systems and tires. But they're profitable commodities in lucrative emerging markets, out of the reach of many in society. They are prohibitively expensive to buy. And it's understandable that these solutions provided by private capital would be emphasized over others. The issue is isolated from larger political and economic drivers, much to strain an analogy as cars isolate us from each other. Community efforts to protect the environment from those bottom-up approaches don't receive the same level of coverage in relation to the platitudes of those in power. And it's in community action, in people coming together and working to reshape their communities, their towns, and their cities to be greener and more equitable is where I think real progress is to be made. I'll leave that there for now. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Nathan. That was really interesting. I've been really interested in the Global Citizen Assembly. I attended one of their presentations, and they seem to be doing really interesting work. And it's an organisation that I'm now following closely, because I think, you're dead right. Part of the way we solve this problem is by, looking at it on that sort of a local level as well. It's also interesting in your point on, the quick fixes. I feel sometimes there's a real narrative that puts the responsibility perhaps disproportionately on the shoulders of individuals as to the impact they can have. So I think it's really interesting comments. Thank you so much for that. Our next speaker is John Fuller. Now, I know that John's been having some problems with his camera, so I don't know if he's managed to resolve them or if he is just joining us on audio. Hopefully you can hear us, John.
Yes, I can hear you loud and clear.
Oh, we can see you as well. Fantastic. So John joins us from Extinction Rebellion. He's been involved in the environmental movement for more than 40 years. And really, we wanted this to be a very broad church in terms of from a range of different views and voices. And we always like to hear a wee bit of controversy at Association for Journalism Education events. I'm saying that you're going to be controversial, John, although part of me hopes that you are. So I will hand over to you. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, sorry about the IT problems. I'm now using a mobile phone. The laptop isn't working. Extinction Rebellion has been incredibly spiky as regards the media. We've mounted some very high-profile demonstrations and protests. We blockaded the print works of the major newspapers in September 2020. We've had two huge demonstrations outside the BBC's HQ. We've organised demonstrations outside ITN, Telegraph, the Mail, huge one outside News Corps. And we argue that we are justified in doing that for several reasons. On a democratic front, I would say to you that you do not live in a free and open democracy if crucial information is withheld from you that would influence the demands you make of politicians. I'd also say that the situation is so bad with the UK media that an expression I often use is that the media has stolen from the young the one thing they needed to defend themselves: information. So yes, Margaret, you're right, I am controversial, but let me now go ahead and try to justify those statements. We argued with the BBC and others that the most frightening information is being suppressed. And this is an argument that's been waged now for quite a long period of time. The Extinction Rebellion's Tell the Truth strand of work is their first demand. They demand that the government explain the gravity of the threat to the people and then allow people to understand why only emergency action is going to save us from mass loss of life. And I'm going to just give you a couple of examples. In 2020, NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in America, changed their forecast for when the Arctic Ocean will be free of ice in the summer, from the 2060s to the year 2034. Now that stuff really matters. This stuff to do with climate feedback is incredibly important, because instead of sunlight for 4 months of the year that the sun doesn't set being reflected back out into space, when the ice is retreated and is replaced by open ocean, it appears black from space and absorbs 90% of the sun's energy. So bodies like the Professor Sir David King's organisation he's recently set up in Cambridge, the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, argues that we actually haven't got a carbon budget left for 1.5 degrees Celsius. They argue that the climate feedbacks are so severe that we actually need to begin a vast carbon removal effort now. Now, the point I would argue, and I have argued for a long period of time with the media, is that the public need to understand this. They need to understand the different opinions and why different scientists, reputable scientists, do hold these different opinions. But also, you know, it's bodies like the government's own official advisors who tell us very frightening things. In June, the Committee on Climate Change, in their risks report, warned us of food disruption here in the UK in the 2040s. And they warned that if the ocean current called the AMOC, which brings the Gulf Stream to us, if that does slow sufficiently or stop, then we actually could face famine here in the UK because we would not have a long growing season. These things are terrifying. The prospects of these things happening are absolutely terrifying. Now, in October this year, just before COP26 was launched, Chatham House produced a report on risks as they saw it, and they said that 3.5 degrees Celsius of heating is plausible by 2100 if governments adhere to the pledges that they've made. But if they don't adhere to the pledges they've made and they carry on exploiting fossil fuels or expanding fossil fuels, then in that report it warns of 7 degrees Celsius of heating. They say there's a 10% chance of 7 degrees Celsius of heating. Now, of course, after COP in the United States, oil exploration was again, the licenses were then allowed. And here in the UK, we're still talking about new oil wells and opening a new coal mine. In Australia, it's all systems go to expand. And in Brazil, we have President Bolsonaro, who's presiding over a situation where deforestation is accelerating. So I would argue that we're not out of the woods. We're far from it. If anything, the media gave us a sense of complacency after the end of COP26, suggesting that maybe we might be lucky and get between 1.8 degrees Celsius or 2.4 degrees Celsius of global heating. But I would put it to you that the evidence is that we are heading for much worse. And that is why we argue, in Extinction Rebellion, we argue that we really have to put up one hell of a fight. And we don't make any friends. And I don't think it's important to understand we're not looking to make any friends. We are here just to stop the very worst outcomes. So just thinking in terms of the media's response, I would say that, as other speakers have mentioned, that there's been quite a fair bit of comment in the media about blaming India and China for the outcome on the final day. But it's important to understand that we in the UK have a much higher standard of living than a lot of people around the world, particularly in India and very many people in China. And we are showing no signs to India and China of changing our lifestyles. what we're doing is saying to those countries, we intend to expand some of our fossil fuel reserves. So it's deeply immoral to then say to countries like China that are relatively poor, well, you've got to stop coal, you've got to stop using the cheapest of the fossil fuels. And it's very, very difficult to see our way through this. I think that Extinction Rebellion, since it was founded, we have actually used very powerful language. Our founders regularly used the expression genocide. And it's not being, we're not being melodramatic. We'd say that we actually do mean it in a very legal sense. At COP26, the Prime Minister of Barbados read out the countries that are going to be annihilated if we exceed 1.5, and she gave everybody a list. And she also gave people a list of the countries in Africa where the populations will be decimated. And people at COP26, a lot of people there were using the expression, this is a death sentence for my country. Now, Article 30 of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court has a provision in it for prosecuting politicians or any kind of leader who initiates policies that will result in mass loss of life, even where there is not direct intent. It's called oblique intent. And Article 30 of the Rome Statute does allow for the prosecution. Now, what's actually happening here in the UK is that our legal authorities will not prosecute. They will not intervene to stop our politicians from completely destroying several low-lying island states, completely annihilating them, but they will throw climate change protesters into prison. James Brown, who climbed on top of a plane at London City Airport, was initially given a 12-month prison sentence. We've now got some Insulate Britain people in prison. One of those is on hunger strike. Now, I would put it to the media that if your nation is engaged in genocide, you've got to just stop what you're doing. You absolutely must stop what you're doing, focus on Article 30 and get it clear in your minds. Is my nation complicit in genocide? Is it conducting genocide? And if there is any truth in that argument at all, then we have got to stop sitting on our hands. We've got to start campaigning in incredibly dynamic ways, and we have to find new ways of stopping the politicians. So that's my message from Extinction Rebellion to the media, is that we live in completely unprecedented times, and we have to stop this. We have to step up. Nobody gets a free pass. None of us has the right to sit on our hands. So that's my message. And thank you for having me here today to talk to you.
Thank you so much. I think a powerful message, and I'll be really interested to hear what some of our colleagues in the news media think. I was, as everybody must have been, completely struck by the opening statement by Mia Motley from Barbados. And certainly for me, it really brought home the gravity of the situation. I think it did for a lot of people. It's interesting that you mentioned Sir David King's Climate Crisis Advisory Group. I attended an event where he spoke and he talked about climate removal. He actually talked about how we need to refreeze the polar ice caps, which that was 2.5 weeks ago, I think I heard him say that. And to this moment, it is still the thing that is completely blowing my mind, the thought that we could refreeze the polar ice caps to the level that they need to be refrozen. So, you know, lots of interesting discussion there and lots of stuff to think about. So thank you so much, John. Can we move on to our next speaker, who is Megan Darby? And I think that Megan is with us on the call. Yeah, because I know you've messaged me, Megan. Now, Megan is the editor of Climate Home News, which is a website that specialises in the international politics of the climate crisis. Megan, welcome.
Thank you, Margaret. Thanks for having me. And I think I would echo what Matt and Leo have said about we're really, you know, still sort of digesting the COP and recovering from it. I decided for a bit of light relief after getting home to start potty training my toddler, which did in a way help deal with the sort of feeling of climate dread, because you can't really spend too much time worrying about the climate when you're hovering over a toddler waiting for them to wee. But that's just me. But yeah, I think there've been lots of great points from our speakers already. So just a bit about me and about Climate Home News and our place in the media landscape. We deliver original reporting that informs and inspires action to tackle the climate crisis. We've been going for 10 years in various forms, and we're based in the UK, but we really have an international outlook, and we really focus quite heavily on the international relations aspect of the climate challenge. So that means the UN climate negotiations, and also other kind of bilateral diplomacy and other processes, and really trying to join the dots between these what can be very arcane and technical discussions and people's lived realities. So I would say, yeah, Glasgow was my 6th COP, and I would say there's been really huge, significant strides since Paris in terms of, you know, if you'd said to anyone in Paris that, you know, in 6 years, India will be saying, yeah, we're going to aim for net zero emissions, they would not have believed you. So huge progress, but absolutely, as John and others have said, not enough for 1.5. Even the most optimistic assessment gets us to 1.8, and we should beware of false precision in this as well, because there's a huge range of uncertainties. So the most optimistic scenario gets us to 1.8 degrees, and that's if everything is fully implemented. And those are big ifs, and there's a lot of scope for journalism to make a difference in how fully that's implemented by holding politicians, by holding leaders to account for what they've signed up to, what they've promised at these summits. So yeah, I would very much echo what Matt started out by saying about information overwhelm. So when you go to these COPs, it's always a bit like that. Your inbox is absolutely flooded. Everybody's trying to get your attention, and you do feel very bombarded. And I have sort of learned from experience to just try and start each day with a bit of a focus of like, okay, here are the stories we're going to pursue, bam, 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 and not get too caught by every passing press release. But I would say this year was a whole different scale, and I think our readers felt that overwhelm too. So we did a bit of a survey of readers afterwards, and you know, a few of them were saying, yeah, there was just so much COP information coming from different sources. It just felt a bit overwhelmed. As Leo mentioned, there were more journalists than ever before. It was more than 3,000 registered, close to 4,000. And I saw some analysis by Axios saying that there were, on average, 8,000 articles about the COP every day over the period. So there was a lot more coverage than ever before. And the great thing is that you know, you've got big mainstream media and national media at all levels, specialist media covering these issues. But there was, that same analysis found that there was much lower engagement with each story because there was so much out there, and it certainly felt to me as an editor that it was harder than normal for our stories to cut through that. So I think important message for any journalist or aspiring journalist is, you know, climate change is not just for the COP. It's a continuous beat, and it's really important. You know, these COPs are critical moments, but you know, they can never be expected to solve the problem, and they are part of a process that then needs to sort of trickle out and be, you know, ripple out through national policies and national plans and you know, bilateral agreements and community action, and, you know, all levels of society. It needs to sort of ripple out, and then it needs to ripple back up, and that reality needs to flow back into the COP, you know, to enable more, you know, more progress in the technical process. So I want to talk a bit about the kind of competing types of story that are competing for your attention when you go to a COP. So I think, as Leo said, there was a lot more focus this COP on sectoral action, and there were a few really big announcements on reducing methane emissions, on reducing deforestation, which is really important and welcome, that these are not, the Paris Agreement talks about emissions, but it does not talk about any specific solutions. And now we're getting to a phase where there needs to be implementation, and there needs to be engagement on these real issues. And actually, getting coal in the text of the agreement was, I agree with Leo, that was a big deal. And phase out or phase down is really a bit of a sideshow. So we're starting to move on to the to the sectoral announcements. But a lot of those sectoral announcements didn't fully stand up to scrutiny. So you've got, for example, you've got more than 100 countries saying we're going to halt deforestation by 2030. But Brazil is on that list, and its actions absolutely say otherwise. And in terms of the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil. And a lot of the big announcements, there were U-turns quite soon afterwards. So it's like the government's added their name to the list without really knowing what they were signing up to. So for example, there was a statement on phasing out coal, which said, rich countries should be phasing out coal in the 2030s and developing countries in the 2040s. And then a couple of governments like Poland afterwards, like, no, our plan is still to end coal in 2049, whatever it was. So there were a few U-turns that undermined those, and you did feel a bit, as a journalist, you were being bombarded by these statements which seemed really big and significant, and like, oh, we should really cover this because this is big and important. But it's kind of hard when you're under pressure to file quickly to really get as much sort of rational critique of them as you want to in the time available. So I think a lot of the first week was taken up with those kind of announcements and the Leaders Summit, and that's where most of the attention was. And it did mean that we were not able to engage as fully as we sometimes did in previous COPs with what was actually under negotiation. We sort of got to that a bit later in the process. But there were some important things in the text, and the text really, it is very technical, and they're speaking in code in these negotiating rooms. But what they eventually agree on is like a process which can allow for more, ratcheting up of ambition or accountability in the process. So they kind of are really nerdy and sort of technical details, but that they can make a difference to what happens next. So one of the key things that was agreed was, so we've mentioned the sort of coal phase out, phase down, that became a last hour issue. And the reason that's so fraught is, as John mentioned, in India, the sort of development, the living standards are much less than we are used to in the West. Lots of people in poverty, and millions of people dependent on coal for their livelihoods. So there was a study out this week that showed that estimated between 13 and 20 million Indians depend on coal for their livelihoods. So that's somewhere between the population of Zimbabwe and Thailand, I think. So it's a huge number of people, and it's not a trivial issue to provide a decent future for those people that doesn't depend on coal. One of the promising announcements was a package of finance for South Africa that's really come out and said, we've got a plan. We want to transition away from coal. We want to make this transition, but we need some financial support to do it. And there was a package of 8.5 billion put together, dollars put together to support that. We haven't seen the details of that. I mean, there's a lot in the implementation, but that's kind of the first time we're seeing a sort of model for how that might look, how there might be international support flowing for that kind of very, very important sort of managing the social, the sort of social consequences and ramifications of moving to cleaner energy. And we've seen in this country that former coal mining towns and villages have never recovered really, and still pretty depressed to this day since the coal mines closed. So I think nobody would wish that on poor parts of India. So yeah, so that's a bit on coal, but yeah, so another important thing in the text was it requested countries to come back with stronger climate plans next year in recognition that what they came up with this year, what they brought to the table this year did not add up to the 1.5 degrees. So to come back next year. So I think a really key sort of accountability question for us is following up with those governments, and are they going to come back? And Australia, which is one of the biggest laggards, Scott Morrison's already said, oh no, that doesn't mean us, we're fine, we're good, for example. And it's even with sort of the EU, which does like to see itself as a climate leader, there's still a bit of a question mark about what that might look like for them. So there's a lot of accountability, important accountability journalism to do there. I would say the other, we've had a bit of attention on that last hour issue. The other big last hour issue, when things run into overtime at these COPs, the way things generally work is you have huddles, literal huddles breaking out on the floor. And I did wonder before the COP whether this would change because of COVID, there's social distancing, but it didn't seem to. People wore masks, but they were still getting up pretty close and personal, because it's really very hard to resolve these sticking points when everybody's just sitting at their desks and speaking one after the other. So to really get to the crunch, everybody just physically gathers together. And one of the biggest and most intense huddles at the end there was between the US and some African and developing country negotiators. So I think Matt McGrath referred to the bruising political power of China and India, which is true, but I think we also take for granted the bruising political power of the US, and that certainly with the Biden administration, there's a lot more will to act on climate than under the previous administration, but they still are pretty resistant to paying for what they have inflicted on vulnerable countries, in terms of the impact of their historic pollution, and that goes for all rich countries, not just the US, but the US really, they are the big power that can make or break this. So what they were huddling over at the last minute was, Africa desperately wants more finance to adapt to the impacts of climate change that they are already experiencing. It's not a future issue. It's hitting people here and now, and they really had to just settle for a sort of assurance that yes, there will be some more adaptation finance. They didn't get what they wanted in the text to support that. So I think that's really important to note. And the other issue that I think maybe Leo touched on is loss and damage, which is the kind of jargon in the process for when you can't adapt anymore and you lose your home, or people lose their lives or livelihoods to climate disasters. What support is there for that? And the rich countries have been very resistant to opening up a new channel of finance to deal with that. They say, oh, we already give humanitarian aid after disasters, and we give adaptation finance, and we don't want to do anything new. But there is a need there which falls between the gaps of those things, and the developing countries were calling for a finance facility to address that, and they didn't get it. What they've got is a 2-year work program which might at some point, or a 2-year dialogue, I think, which might at some point result in some finance. So it's a really, really grindingly slow and difficult process for the vulnerable countries, the most vulnerable countries, to get what they want there. The other thing we haven't really touched on in the text was, it was tidying up the rules of the Paris Agreement. And one of the big things there was Article 6, and which deals with carbon trading. So one country paying for another country to reduce their emissions, and counting that reduction towards their own targets, claiming credit for that reduction. So it's kind of effectively offsetting their emissions. And that's a really tricky one, because they had this under the Kyoto Protocol, when it was only rich countries that had emissions targets, and now everybody has emissions targets. So how do you, so the developing countries also want to claim credit for emissions reductions. So how do you square that circle, and how do you avoid double counting is the crucial thing, where you're both claiming credit for it, but the climate only sees one set of emissions reduction. So that's quite a big issue. They did finally reach an agreement on there. It seemed to avoided the worst loopholes, but there is still a few potential loopholes there that could weaken the overall ambition and action. And just very final point, so I don't know how I'm doing for time, but I see Margaret nodding at me and unmuting herself, so she's probably about to jump in any moment. I would say that at this COP, there was more tension than ever between the inside and the outside. I felt that quite strongly, that there was really this sense that there'd been quite, the inside was quite corporate captured. There were, somebody counted up, there were 500 fossil fuel lobbyists in there, and all these corporate pavilions and so on. And then you had the activists who were really angry and came in really angry. There was real, because of all the COVID restrictions, a lot of delegates from developing countries had a much harder time even getting there. The costs were really high. So there was a lot of anger and coming into it, and really a lot of skepticism from the streets about this, carbon markets and carbon trading, greenwash, net zero. So I think there was a lot of drama, a lot of tension, a lot of information overwhelm. It's going to take some time to unpack it all, but I think there's a really important role for journalists in sustaining that accountability over the year and the years to come.
Lots of energy around it. That was one of the most interesting things, being somebody who, it really was happening on my doorstep. And there was just such energy in the air. And just talking to just some pals who are also journalists here in Glasgow who were covering it. We spent a few days afterwards. It's interesting that you guys who reported it are saying, oh my God, we needed to recover so much, we're still trying to recover. And we've been saying the complete opposite, which is we absolutely loved it and thrived on it here in Glasgow. So could it come back again?
Can I also say, I did a homestay because the Airbnb hosts were cashing in. It was outrageous, but the nicer side of that was there was this homestay scheme, and I stayed with a family, and they were very welcoming. It was really lovely. Loved Glasgow.
I do, yes. I think actually if anybody get anything positive from COP26, it was absolutely solely down to the fact it was held in the greatest city in the world. Of course,
lovely city.
I would say that. Thank you so much, Megan. So much there to unpack. I was slightly alarmed by the fact that there were 8,000 stories every single day. Oh my God, that is an infodemic if ever there was one. Thank you. Lots of interesting points that I'm sure we can pick up in the chat. A couple of people have raised their hands, but I'm just going to say it's really great that people want to contribute, but if we could just keep that until each of the speakers have spoken, and then we'll have some time for questions. So thank you. Our next speaker, and I'm really pleased to welcome Hannah McNeish, because Hannah is a good friend of my programme at the University of the West of Scotland, where she has come and spoken to my students before. And Hannah is a freelance journalist who has been reporting on climate change, women's issues, global health, science, conflict and human rights, and has spent a lot of her time reporting from the continent of Africa. So hopefully Hannah is here. Hannah?
Yeah.
Yes, Hannah is here. And I have to say it's lovely to see you, Hannah, because we have been seeing each other for quite a long time. And Hannah was involved in lots of really different projects during COP26. I was quite envious of some of the work that Hannah was doing. So Hannah, what was your perspectives, or what are your perspectives on it?
So just to introduce myself, as a freelance journalist, I've been living in Scotland, well, Glasgow, for 3 years, but prior to that I was in sub-Saharan Africa for 8 years, and in Latin America before that. So I guess I started reporting on what we now call climate change about a decade ago, when it was just kind of, an environmental story. I'm primarily a human rights journalist, and I was quite reticent to call myself a climate change journalist because I thought that I didn't know enough. I have a background in modern languages rather than science, and had really discounted myself as somebody who should be reporting on science and who could report on climate change. So just in case there are other journalists on this call, there's quite a lot of imposter syndrome that comes on when it comes to climate change reporting. And it's part of the reason why, I was happy to speak today to kind of talk to people about how baffling and overwhelming it might seem to be a climate change reporter when you are dealing with quite complicated reports coming out, quite a lot of geopolitics, and just to kind of say that the kind of reporting that I've always done has been very person-centered and very much from a human rights point of view. And if the journalism is about people, which it really is, most of my work really comes down to simplifying stories and telling them in a way that can engage the public. And I really think there's a great place for that. There are some of my environmental climate change journalist heroes on here in terms of the Carbon Briefs and the Matt McGrath, and I think Matt has actually fact checked one of the BBC radio documentaries that I've done on climate change, thankfully, because there are people that know the ins and outs of every single resolution passing and keep up to this, keep up day to day on what's happening. So my reporting has really been grassroots, and it took me a long time to come to terms with the fact that I did kind of know what I was talking about. And that was because a friend of mine who is doing a PhD in climate change communication said, this is what we need in climate change reporting. We need more people who can come at this from a different angle, who can come at this from a rights angle, because I think that increasingly over the years, this has become a human rights story. And especially where I've worked in developing countries, this is already cross-cutting absolutely every development issue you could think of, from shelter to health, to education. And I think that from what we've seen in Europe this past summer, it will get to that point here as well. And I think we've seen some really interesting stories coming out of Scotland ahead of COP that also show that there are some fantastic stories to do that take place outside the conference centre. I mean, I covered COP and I didn't actually even ever go to the centre, but I was working with a group of activists for a charity, actually, to try and get stories from people coming from the global south who were already hugely underrepresented, and as we talked about, these very large political delegations and also fossil fuels, etc., just to get them as much airtime as possible and to put a lot of this science and politics into context. So as I said, the people who are following the really high-end negotiations, and then just finding spokespeople who can really put a face to this story. And we are talking about living through an era where there is so much skepticism and pushback against science, and we've seen this with COVID-19. I think we're seeing it with climate change. I thought it was really interesting listening to Extinction Rebellion and others talking about, the need to talk about this as an emergency, the need to really drum home to people that this is an existential crisis, that everybody is at risk. And it's very interesting because in part of my work, I've gone back and forth on this. I've done a lot of stories that are the doomsday headlines. And then due to working with a friend of mine quite a lot who does have a PhD in climate change communications, a lot of my work has pivoted to solutions-based stories, pointing out the doomsday scenario and then pointing out what we can do with it, because it has been shown that, you know, a lot of people just put their heads in the sands immediately if you just point out, you know, it's a bit like throw your hands up in the air, you know, the world is on fire, there's, you know, a lot of my work in the past few years has really been trying to involve aspects of that. And not to say that, you know, a lot of the stories that I have reported on and found are, you know, incredibly dramatic and grim, and they've come through charities and UN agencies. So I've worked as a consultant for UN Environment on various things and organized environmental conferences, and I'm so glad I didn't have anything to do with organizing COP, because it's the most stressful thing I've ever done. But trying to highlight some of these enormous issues of what does pollution mean, what does emissions mean, and that has involved taking journalists to see, you know, a turtle hospital where turtles are floating in little water beds because they've choked on plastics. It's been visiting, you know, organising to visit people, abattoirs where plastic is being pulled out of cows. You know, it's been inviting astronauts to come to a summit to talk to journalists to basically kind of get them more interested, and because it's, you know, to have a different voice. It's been finding school children who are doing interesting things, you know, to hook people into a story, and also just not to make sure that these stories aren't just being told by scientists and politicians, because we have seen from increasingly over a range of subjects that, you know, there has been some pushback of swathes of the society not wanting to listen to like the elite. And as far as I've seen in climate reporting, the seeing is believing approach is really helpful to get a wider audience, and especially in development where you know, conservation and a lot of environmentalism has been seen as quite patronizing, and, you know, post-colonialism, a bunch of white people coming over and telling people what to do and how to behave, especially because it's a problem that they actually did the least to contribute to. You know, emissions, etc., are mostly by the West, and I think it's poignant that we're holding this on Black Friday, and I completely agree with a lot of people about the narrative of China, India, etc., causing emissions, but at the same time it's where all our stuff comes from. And I thought that was a really interesting dynamic at COP as well. And just to go back to what other people said, I thought it was really interesting, yeah, how many reporters were covering this, even if they weren't in Glasgow. And yeah, based on what I saw in quite a few Twitter threads, and as myself, I still don't consider myself an expert, but how interesting it was that a lot of people are obviously taking this on as a new beat. And a lot of what was said by certain countries or pledges or politicians that, you know, if you've been covering this for a while, you might think, is this lip service, was printed quite quickly. And then there were, you know, having to be a few retractions or a few edits, which is a dangerous game because people often just remember what happened and they don't remember that afterwards. So political reporters, I think, are really, you know, useful for coming into this as well to add some balance. And I think it was a real learning curve for some reporters who maybe haven't covered this, and also have expanded beyond UK coverage to understand more, you know, more foreign desk reporting, really, because this is a global problem, and it does require a global solution. So it does really require a lot more understanding of what's going on further afield and the developments at play. So I also was, arranging quite a lot of media trips and trying to place quite a lot of media for a range of climate organizations, and it was just so saturated. I've never known I've organized UN environmental summits, and it was easier to place stories. And yeah, a bit like what Margaret said, you know, an infodemic is a perfect sum up of it. And even organizations that I was speaking to were saying, you know, we can't keep up with what's happening. There was a 30-minute podcast or something at the end of the day that people were listening to just try and get to understand it. And it is so important to have more of that drip feed rather than everything be based in 2 weeks. You know, I was trying to get media to come along to Glasgow schools where a bunch of activists and an astronaut were talking to kids, and I've never struggled so much. Yeah, I hope that this movement or this amount of attention can continue, and that people do realize that there are many stories out there, there are many heroes out there, there are many spokespeople out there, and that if there are any reporters who can simplify these stories and show it from a simpler perspective. I mean, we've seen how a Swedish well, not Child anymore, but back then, Child has done more to get people to understand the complexities of climate change and the need to act than many different scientists. And I know a couple of people mentioned David King, who's somebody who I've interviewed and who is wonderful in terms of not speaking as if he's speaking to other academics, despite the fact that he's hugely intelligent, but managing to relay the information to quite a mainstream audience. And yeah, I guess that would be what I would say to other reporters. If you don't understand the incredibly complex reports and science, that is absolutely fine. It's actually probably a good thing, because you will go away and really try and break it down to a format that everyone understands. There was one thing I wanted to talk about in terms of Extinction Rebellion, which I thought was really interesting, because I actually covered the G7 event as well, and organized a media stunt around access to vaccines for people from developing countries, especially so that they could come to COP, and climate finance for the developing world. And we had a ice cream van that was giving away ice creams with lots of different puns based on climate and vaccines. Anyway, we went to a lot of Extinction Rebellion events, and it was very interesting to see how my own perspective and many other people's perspective of what that organization and community involvement actually entails, and the kind of bad rap that it gets in certain media. Whereas this seemed like an extremely well organized, polite, friendly group of people doing great work. And I think that COP was really interesting as well for showing that kind of peaceful resistance by a lot of community movements. And I think, yeah, if we are talking about journalism as people, then there were so many people to interview, from youth to Extinction Rebellion to lots of different groups that came out of the woods and were very far from the negotiating table. So I guess I'm not sure I've got anything more to add beyond some of the work that I've done, and I will now be pivoting from journalism to join a charity as the head of comms, and really telling those human-centered stories. And it's very interesting that that's actually now what charities and large organizations are after. They've kind of realized that they've got the science sorted, they've got the policy and advocacy people. What is needed now are communications people who can go out there and tell stories about what's really at stake. And I've covered everything from what I thought were going to be development stories, in the Sudanese desert, and people's whose entire villages have been covered by sand, people who live on islands that everything has been almost washed up, kind of graveyards have disappeared, and people have had to transport remains from higher and higher ground. This is stuff that's been happening for years, and that we don't really pay attention to because, well, in Europe, because it's the other side of the world. And I think we're now seeing the climate crisis hit here, or we know what's coming. And it's I think it's really interesting, the balance between pointing out just how severe it is without losing an audience, because people don't want to, well, they're coping with an existential crisis in the form of a pandemic, and then there's now this on top. So I think it's really interesting, thinking about storytelling and the way in which we tell stories, and who should have that voice. And as I said, my COP was getting people who were activists from the developing world onto as much media as possible, and talking about how, this is what's happening to us now, and going to a school that had like a mild flooding, and everyone was up in arms about it, and hearing them talk about X% of people in my country don't go to school because climate change is daily. These aren't just shock weather events, and having that kind of, like we are now, having that back and forth and that Q&A session, and I think that was the Glasgow effect for many people in the UK, and especially for many young people, from what I could see. So anyway, I think that's me.
Fantastic. Thank you, Hannah. Brilliant. Really interesting for you to just boil it down to what it is, which is it's a story about people and about people's lives, and that can often get lost in the complexity of the science sometimes. But I think you're dead right. I think that there are lots of human stories that we need to tell in very human ways. I was also really struck at COP26, which I'm sure you were as well, by the different ways in which the stories are being told. So like through documentary, through film, through arts and theatre groups, and lots of the different fringe events that were going on. That was something that really struck me as well. And how do you get those stories as well to wider audiences? But great, thank you. Really interesting perspective, and I love the phrase, which I think you should now copyright, which is the Glasgow effect. That was I like that. That's like, I'm going to use that mercilessly, but I will always.
You could talk it the warming West.
Thank you so much, Hannah. So we now move to our last speaker in this session, and I have to say I'm really delighted to welcome our final speaker, Joelma Viana, all the way from Brazil, and I will do my very best to welcome her properly. Bom dia, seja bem-vinda, Joelma. Now, Joelma is joining us from the Amazon forest area. She's the manager of Amazon News Network, and she is going to be speaking to us today with the assistance of our AJE committee member and senior lecturer at Derby University, Ivana Ebel. So Ivana is going to translate. Ivana, are you and Joelma ready to present?
I am ready. Joelma, tá tudo certo aí para começar?
Tudo certo. Posso compartilhar?
Yes, you can share. Sim, você pode compartilhar. Just to let you know, Joelle will be speaking in Portuguese, and I will be translating right after. Every time she says something, I will repeat it in English, okay? So it's not my saying, but it's Joelma's words that I will be repeating.
Okay, thank you. Now, this is the first time that we've done this at AJE, and we're really excited to welcome Joelma, and we're really delighted that Ivana is helping us out in this way. So I will hand over to you, Joelma and Viana. Thank you.
Joelma, ela disse que eles são muito felizes em fazer isso, é a primeira vez que eles fazem um evento com tradução, e por isso que ela está muito feliz em te receber. Muito obrigada por estar aqui. A palavra é tua.
Obrigada. Bom dia a todos e todas. Estou muito feliz de estar aqui com vocês nesse encontro e agradecer pelo convite.
Good morning to everyone. I'm very, very happy to be here with you today, and I would like to say thank you for the invitation.
Eu vou falar um pouco sobre a comunicação no território amazônico a partir da perspectiva da rede de notícias da Amazônia, da qual faço parte.
I'm going to talk about the communication in the Amazon area from the perspective of the Amazon News Network. That's the one I'm being part of. Tudo certo aí?
Tudo certo. Não estava conseguindo passar, mas agora tranquilo.
She was like having trouble passing the slides, but everything is all right now.
Tá. Eu me chamo Joelma Viana, moro aqui em Santarém, no estado do Pará, na Amazônia brasileira.
She lives, her name is Joelma Viana. She lives in Santarém, is a city in the state of Pará, and it's part of the Brazilian Amazon.
Sou graduada em letras, tenho especialização em jornalismo científico e também mestrado na área de educação.
She graduated in Portuguese language, has a post-graduation in scientific journalism and a master's in education.
Também trabalho já há 20 anos no rádio e com foco principalmente no trabalho da educação ambiental e também voltado principalmente para a educação.
She's been working for 20 years in radio, especially working in environmental education and working connected to education, related to education is the work that she does.
Eu sou gestora da rede de notícias da Amazônia. Essa rede já existe há 13 anos.
I'm the manager of the Amazon News Network, and we have been doing this work with the Amazon News Network. It's around for 13 years already.
Então, falar pouco sobre a rede de notícias e o que eu vou falar já está transcrito aqui no slide.
I'm going to explain you about the Amazon Network, News Network, but what I'm going to tell you is already translated on the slide, so you can follow me on the translation on the slides.
A Rede de Notícias da Amazônia é uma associação de emissoras de rádio sem fins lucrativos que tem como meta democratizar a comunicação na região amazônica, priorizando o ponto de vista dos lutadores sociais ou os defensores do meio ambiente e dos direitos humanos, através da divulgação de suas ações políticas, econômicas, culturais e sociais. A nossa missão é contribuir para uma sociedade mais humana e cristã, de uma Amazônia respeitada em seu ecossistema, valorizando as culturas originárias de seus povos e também da sociedade civil.
That's it.
Falar pouco sobre a região amazônica. Esse é o mapa da Amazônia brasileira.
This is the map of the Brazilian part of the Amazon.
A Amazônia brasileira, ela tem pouco mais da metade do território brasileiro, tem cerca de 59% desse território.
The Brazilian side of the Amazon covers about 59% of the Brazilian territory.
São 5 milhões de quilômetros quadrados e são pouco mais de 30 milhões de pessoas vivendo nesse território.
There's around 5 million square kilometers, and around 30 million of individuals living in the Amazon area.
A Amazônia brasileira, ela tem 9 estados e a rede de notícias da Amazônia está em 7 desses estados. Maranhão, Pará, Amapá, Roraima, Amazonas, Acre, Rondônia, são os estados onde estamos.
The Brazilian Amazon covers 9 states of the country, and the Amazon News Network is in 7 of them. And then Joelma listed the states that where are they, and you can see them on the map.
São 20 emissoras de rádio associadas e outras 4 que são parceiras nossas.
The Amazon News Network that she manages has 20 associated radio stations and 4 other partners that work together with them.
Se a Amazônia brasileira ela fosse país, seria o 6º maior do mundo em extensão territorial.
If just the Brazilian part of the Amazon forest was supposed to be a country, it will be the 6th largest in the world.
Sobre o trabalho que desenvolvemos na região amazônica, né? Nós fazemos a produção jornalística, é feita a partir do ponto de vista dos lutadores sociais, ou seja, dos defensores de direitos humanos, defensores de meio ambiente, e não a partir do que as empresas, do que o governo está fazendo.
The work that they do in the Amazon forest is always from a perspective from environmental defenders and human rights, and they're not like led by why the government does or why the biggest companies and business do in the area.
A nossa preocupação em trazer justamente a fala dessas populações é que muitas vezes elas não têm sua fala dentro dos grandes veículos de comunicação que temos no Brasil.
We are always worried and bring these voices to our network because these people, they normally are not represented by the legacy and traditional media in Brazil.
Nós destacamos principalmente os problemas ambientais que temos na Amazônia, né? Mas não apenas falando desses problemas. Nós também procuramos apresentar como as populações amazônicas têm vivido em harmonia com a natureza.
We talk a lot about the problems and environmental problems that the Amazon region are facing, but we are not exclusively focused on problems. We also report on how the communities live in harmony with the environment in the area.
E aqui é importante destacar que a COP26, ela acabou não trazendo boas perspectivas para as populações amazônicas, porque os problemas continuam mesmo, né? E logo após a COP, a gente tem um dado de que a Amazônia tem a pior índice de desmatamento de todos os anos.
We have to say that we are still sad because the COP26 didn't brought the news that we expected in the Amazon area, and just right after that we got the official information that the Amazon faced the largest deforestation in the recent years.
Nós também nos preocupamos em fortalecer as culturas das populações amazônicas e principalmente focando na divulgação do que é regional.
We also work to enhance and strengthen the culture of Amazon populations, and we are very much focused on local cultures and what people do locally.
Quais são os nossos principais desafios para produzir uma comunicação comprometida dentro do território amazônico?
What are our biggest challenges to produce like a faithful communication within the Amazon area?
A principal dificuldade são as distâncias, porque há lugares em que para se chegar nós passamos 3 dias, às vezes 12 dias, e precisamos sair muitas vezes de barco, porque não chega nem avião e nem carro.
The distance are the biggest challenge that we face. Sometimes to reach a community that we want to report about, we have to travel for 3 days and sometimes even for 12 days in a boat because they're not reachable by cars or even by planes.
E também temos uma outra preocupação, pensamento elitista de muito recém-formados jornalistas que acabam não compreendendo essa preocupação com os lutadores sociais.
There's also a problem with the young journalists that are graduating from the university, that they have like some sort of an elitist way of thinking, and they do not really understand, they cannot grasp the importance of the fights and the social movements in the Amazon area.
Outro grande desafio é a falta de formação dos profissionais que atuam na região amazônica. Isso porque, por conta das distâncias, não consegue se chegar aos lugares onde existe universidade para fazer formação. E a maioria dessas pessoas são comunicadores que aprenderam na prática.
There's a huge problem in having professionals that they are like trained and educated in university because of the distance, because it's too hard to travel to reach the university education. And then what happened is that in many places, communication and journalism is only made by people who learn by doing it. They have no formal education or training on reporting.
Há também a ausência de recursos para o desenvolvimento desse trabalho e a limitação que muitas vezes é imposta por alguns veículos de comunicação que estão muitas vezes ligados a empresas destruidoras da Amazônia.
There is a general lack of financial resources to do this work, but also there are like some sort of limitations and censorship that's imposed by biggest networks that they work in connection with companies and business that unfortunately are connected to the destruction of the forest.
Por conta dessa opção que temos na defesa dos direitos humanos, do meio ambiente, a preocupação com as populações da região amazônica, muitos jornalistas acabam sofrendo intimidação e, às vezes, até ameaça, como nós já registramos dentro do grupo que trabalha na rede.
One of the biggest problems that we face is that because we decided to work to work with this position that reinforces human rights and environment, and also because we defend the local populations, some of our journalists inside the Amazon News Network face intimidations, and sometimes they receive threats. So that's another problem we face.
Sobre a formação, que eu também trabalho na área da educação, sou professora de ensino superior, no curso de jornalismo e publicidade.
I also want to bring you some perspectives because I'm also a university lecturer. So I teach at the university in journalism programs and other programs, and I want to bring you this perspective.
A grande preocupação é adaptar o currículo para a realidade amazônica. Muitas vezes os currículos são pensados a partir dos grandes centros e não têm uma visão com a nossa região, que é bem diferenciada.
In general, the national curriculum for journalism education is thought from the big cities perspectives, like from the great urban centers, and they're not adapted and they're not focused on what we do regionally, because our reality is very different from the ones that they are thought to.
A falta de acesso dos comunicadores às universidades nas áreas interioranas, como acabei de mencionar anteriormente, e também a gente destaca a falta de profissionais formados na área para atuar na docência. Eu, por exemplo, sou formada na área de letras e estou na docência por conta da experiência que tenho já dentro da comunicação.
There's a lack of access, as she mentioned before, because of the distance. Everything is too far away. But there's also a problem with people who graduated in journalism. They don't have many people graduated in journalism to teach journalism for the next generations. She mentioned that she herself didn't graduate in journalism. She graduated in Portuguese language, but she teaches on the journalism program due to her broad experience working as a journalist.
Outros profissionais não conseguem fazer uma graduação por falta de recursos financeiros, porque a maioria das universidades que estão nos interiores, nas cidades mais distantes das metrópoles, eles geralmente são cursos em universidades pagas e são caros.
Another problem is the financial resources for the ones who really want to study, because in the small cities, in the countryside, normally the universities that will open like a campus there, they are private universities, and the education will be very expensive, so the communication professionals cannot afford to join the university, even if they have some in their locations.
E as distâncias para chegar até as universidades, para cursar, então, fazer o curso superior, precisam morar em outro local e muitas vezes acabam não conseguindo fazer isso.
And again, because of the distance, that is absolutely huge. Lots of professionals, they cannot afford to move to a different city because they cannot remain where they are born. They have to move to a bigger city to attend the university, and they cannot afford that because of the distance. They are so huge.
Antes de concluir, dizer que é um prazer muito grande estar podendo falar sobre a região amazônica, essa região que é bem diferente do que a grande mídia acaba divulgando.
Before finishing, I would like to say thank you, because it's a huge pleasure for me to have the chance to talk about the Amazon region, because we are so different than the way that the media portrays us.
Amazônia, nós dizemos que dentro da Amazônia existem outras Amazônias, porque há territórios bem diferenciados, são diferentes povos, são diferentes culturas, e esses povos, culturas e também a realidade precisa ser falada a partir do ponto de vista de quem vive no local.
We used to say that inside Amazon, we have several different Amazons because we have different people, different tribes, different cultures, and different realities. And Amazon must be portrayed from the perspective of the ones who are living there.
E ao contrário do que o governo Bolsonaro destaca, na região amazônica nós temos sim muitos problemas, principalmente relacionados ao desmatamento, à exploração dos nossos minérios e principalmente à retirada dos povos dos seus territórios.
And different from what Bolsonaro is preaching, we do have indeed several problems in the Amazon area, especially regarding the deforestation and the mineral exploration, and also because of the removal and the dislocation of the indigenous populations from their traditional territories.
Thank you.
And thank you, muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada, Joelma. Fascinating to hear your perspective. It's really interesting that, you know, we're here in the UK, and COP26 was a big story here, and I wonder how much of it actually reached the people in the Amazon and how meaningful it actually was to them.
Eu fico muito feliz em ouvir a tua história, muito agradecida, Joelma, e eu fico pensando até que ponto as histórias do COP26 chegaram até a Amazônia, né? Se isso foi só uma história de fundo, né, durante o COP.
Na verdade, a gente acabou divulgando algumas ações, porque tivemos algumas lideranças indígenas que estavam presentes na COP26. E nós divulgamos a COP a partir do olhar dos povos indígenas que estavam presentes.
It became news here in the Amazon area and for us in the Amazon network, news network, because we had some local leadership, some indigenous representatives that attended the conference in Glasgow. And so we did our coverage through their visions. We report what they were seeing there.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much, Joelma and Ivana. That was our first for the AJE and hopefully not the last time. And we very much hope that we can welcome Joelma back, and certainly from the perspective of the Association for Journalism Education. Let's see how we can support what it is you're seeking to do with your network, if we can.
Joelma,
we would love to help.
Essa foi a nossa primeira vez fazendo uma coisa assim, mas nós esperamos que não seja a última, e nós gostaríamos de convidar você para voltar aqui outras vezes. E nós, da perspectiva da Associação Britânica de Jornalismo e Educação, nós queremos ver em como nós podemos dar suporte a esse trabalho que você está fazendo, porque nós queremos muito ajudar.
Nós agradecemos, estamos muito felizes de estarmos aqui, poder compartilhar essas nossas experiências e também ouvir outras experiências a partir do trabalho que é feito. É bom saber que outras pessoas também fazem trabalhos parecidos com o nosso, com os que nós desenvolvemos, e que a gente pode estar somando para fazer a diferença e ter um mundo melhor, porque nós acreditamos que o mundo pode ser melhor a partir do trabalho que fazemos.
We are very grateful for being here in sharing this experience, and also from hearing from different people and to know that other people are doing things that similar to the ones that we are doing, because here we strongly believe that the world can be a better place through the work we do.
Absolutely, I think we would all agree with that. Thank you so much. Can I just thank everyone? Joelma was our last speaker in this first session, and we are running slightly over, but I'm quite conscious of time. So I know that some people did have some questions. So I'm going to say if we maybe take even 10 minutes of questions, which I know is quite short, but we do want to try and start the second session as close to 3 o'clock or maybe 5 past if we can. Is there anybody who would like to ask a question at the moment? Jeffrey, Lean, you've had your hand up for so long, so thank you so much for being so patient. If you want to unmute, you can go ahead and ask your question, and if you want to direct it at a specific speaker, please do, and hopefully everyone's here.
Thanks so much. I'm sorry to have been late. I had another Zoom and I've got to go in a minute. I'm going to be very brief, but I just want to represent journalists against what John Fuller said. My locus for doing so is that I've been doing this since 1970, January 1970. And the other day I was looking through old papers and I came across this, which I think has a strong enough headline, even for, the headline is Evidence for Global Disaster. A strong enough headline even for John to be happy with. The date on it, I wrote it, the date is the 30th of October, 1974. So some of us have been going this for quite a long time. And though John talks about us failing to write about the Gulf Stream, I wrote about that with all its disasters in 1995. You know, and a lot of us have been going on for a long, long time. Yeah. And I was alone for a long time, but then there was quite a core of us in the 90s. And nobody else was doing it. I was being rung up by scientists and abused for what I was saying. The head of the Met Office some years before said, climates never change, young man, and humans could not possibly be responsible for it. The NGO showed no interest whatsoever in climate change until the mid-1990s. So we were there, and loads of us lost our jobs. A couple of us, and I'm one of them, were fired twice. And so I'd just like to make the point that we have been going at it rather long, and John's, you know, we're not the sort of monsters that John paints us out to be. Now the, you know, and really, for someone who goes alone, the situation now is incredible. 8,000 articles a day on a COP. A lot of newspapers now have more people on climate than any other single subject. I mean, this is not enough. Things are not being said strongly enough, but it's a hell of a change. And frankly, what Extinction Rebellion has done in the press has been counterproductive. I have a lot of respect for Extinction Rebellion. I think what they did in April 1980, April 2 years ago, 1990, whatever it was extraordinary. It played a very big part in shifting the debate in Britain. And much of what it does still now is absolutely excellent. But at times things go to their heads. And we've seen that. We saw that in the tube station. We saw it with abusing Attenborough. We've also seen it with Insulate Britain, which is slightly on the side. And this is then counterproductive. And frankly, newspapers don't give a toss if you demonstrate outside. And the editors don't give a damn. The owners don't give a damn. The people who suffer are the people within the papers, like I was for 50 years, who are battling in the papers to try and get the papers taking this more seriously. Because editors hate being told by somebody outside what to do. And lots of my successors have told me this about Extinction Rebellion's demonstrations to try to stop papers. It was utterly counterproductive. So I'll ask John and ask the question if you like, but my point really is, please, a little bit of humility, a little bit of understanding, and a little bit of comradeship with the people who've tried and devoted their careers and put their jobs at risk for doing what you want to happen.
Thank you. John, I don't know if you're still on the call and maybe want to respond to what Jeffrey said.
Yeah, of course. And, you know, Jeffrey's absolutely right. There are people there who have been battling on this topic for decades, and I've been battling the media for decades as well. I will just say that up to 2017, you know, we still had Climate Change Deniers being given a platform on the BBC. From 2018, following our protests, there was a radical change at the BBC.
It wasn't following you. It wasn't following you that caused that change. Never mind, go on. You weren't responsible, but anyway, go on.
But the simple fact of the matter is that the coverage that's now been given to climate change is vastly improved across a range of networks. And, you know, and I include ITV in that because we had the protests outside the ITV buildings. And within a few months, they'd introduced their new segment called Earth on the Edge. Now, all of this could be coincidental, but I just bring it back to the fact, though, that we aren't talking about any other kind of news story. We're talking about mass loss of life on an unprecedented scale, and people are going to lose their tempers and people are going to act rashly. And I think that if you're talking about genocide, then you're going to understand that people will act rashly. And as things get worse, and they will get worse because we have lost 1.5 now, then people are going to become ever more desperate in the way that they react. So I think that there's got to be an understanding that particularly young people are furious about what's been done to them. If we just look at the press at the moment, if we look at the Telegraph, it still is putting out misinformation. You know, in the Telegraph a few months ago, we had this article about net zero would cost every household £100,000. Well, you know, that is terrible misinformation. And, you know, there are sections of the media like The Sun and the Telegraph that are being grossly irresponsible. But all sections of the media are so much better than they were in 2017. Now, you know, I don't think it's coincidental that, you know, Extinction Rebellion really got into its stride in 2018. So I am sorry, Jeffrey, if I've caused you any offence. I don't want to. And I know that there's some brilliant journalists out there trying incredibly hard to break through against intransigent owners and editors. But Extinction Rebellion, we're just going to keep going, and we are making progress. We trip up every now and again, and when we do, we'll apologise. But rebellions are messy. That's where we're at. Rebellions are.
My last word, I'm just appealing to you not to be counterproductive on the press. I think I have the right to say what I know I'm talking about, because I have spent a lifetime working inside the press. And the last period of my life, I went to the Telegraph precisely because it was a denial newspaper. And having been entirely denial newspaper, it came a long way back from that. And that was neither of Extinction Rebellion. That was the work that I and a few other people did in the Telegraph. Now, a lot of crap is still printed there, but you still have 3 or 4 good environment correspondents who are getting good stuff in, and by and large, the news is straight on the Telegraph. And other people have done that work inside the papers hard. Extinction Rebellion, I gave you tribute, had the part in changing the atmosphere, but it's not all down to you. It's down to the work that people have been doing at risk of their livelihoods over many, many years, and a little acknowledgement of that would be appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your contribution, Jeffrey and John. I think this is probably something that we could debate for quite a long time. Does anybody else have any questions they'd like to ask of any of our speakers? Could I maybe ask one of Matt, if he's still here? Obviously, the BBC, you know, one of the most consumed news organisations, one of the most trusted. How do you think the BBC's climate coverage has changed over the period of time in which you've reported on it?
Yeah, it's changed hugely across the piece, as I think everybody can see. While John might think that it's down to Extinction Rebellion, I would say that it's more Jeffrey than John in this circumstances, I would say. Notwithstanding the impact that Extinction Rebellion have made, I think they've been coincidental in terms of what we're seeing in the world. I mean, people can see for themselves. That's the big change, you know. Editors at the BBC can see for themselves what's happening in the world and in our reporting of it. They've also seen the science. You know, perhaps the most significant thing that we've covered in all of this in some respects was the 1.5 report from the IPCC in 2018. That was, you know, it got really lucky in the sense there wasn't other news around that time, but it really landed with a huge bang. And that really helped, I think, change perspectives in the world. But before that, going back 10 years or so, the BBC has been on a path moving towards, and I know there have been occasional mistakes, shall I call them that, and occasional wrong guess, but you know, we've come a long way in a short time too, and that doesn't happen anymore, and it won't be happening anymore. And you know, there's a long bedrock of people like Jeff and Roger Harrabin and others who have made their careers into helping the BBC turn this corner, and that has happened. And you know, I think the way that the BBC is championing this story now and dealing with the story across the world is we recognize it's the story of our time, and it's not going away. We're committed to this, I feel, for the long period. So yeah, it maybe, as I said earlier, we were slow to get there, but we're there now, and we will be there, and we will be holding people's feet to account on this and doing our best to tell the truth as we go forward.
Great, thank you. We've got a few hands up. I'm going to go first to Kate Williams, and then next to Simon Cotto, and I think probably we then just need to bring this session to a close. Obviously, it's a topic that people do want to comment on. Kate.
I was interested to hear you say how the political journalists were there as well as environmental journalists, and how they were being briefed and brought up to speed. And now it's such an international story. How do you ensure that the kind of the science of the story is there rather than just the populist headlines? Is it now a blurring and everyone will be reporting it?
Yeah, that's right. And you do hit on a good point there, Kate. I mean, it is more challenging now, as you say. There are more political correspondents, political reporters, and who have the latest scoop from Number 10, etc., or wherever it might be, whatever political party or government that is involved in it, and that is essentially often going above the heads of the scientists, etc., or going above the heads directly to the people. And that is, I think that's where the battle, in some respects, is now going forward. We're going to continue to have a lot of science on this. Obviously, we've got 3 more IPCC reports out next year, and I guess ultimately we would say we have a role here. We need to be continuing in our role to highlight the science, to keep account of what governments have said as well, although political correspondents, of course, have that role too. So yeah, in greater internal battles, I imagine, at the BBC, because obviously that's something we don't do at all. So
great, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Kate. And Simon Cotto. Simon, you wanted to make a point.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no, I just wanted to make an observation, really. That I think perhaps it's slightly unfortunate if there tends to be a dichotomy thrown into the air. You know, on the one hand, it's Extinction Rebellion, and then on the other, it's journalism. Both journalists and Extinction Rebellion, of course, share something in common. They share the fact that they emanate from civil society, a civil society that's becoming increasingly concerned, rightly, with the impending peril that the world now confronts. And of course, there have been many journalists, and are, thankfully, journalists who are doing a wonderful job, and many have been, as Jeffrey was saying, from the 1970s. In fact, climate change, of course, was known scientifically. I think it goes back to 1912. You can find a news report which actually identifies climate change as the kind of the blanket of coal there and then. And as we see now, journalists in the BBC and elsewhere have provided some amazing reporting, trying to find the interconnection between climate change and human consequences around the world, and placing that in humanistic context through very powerful visuals and clearly heartfelt reporting, which is wonderful, I think. But we also see, do we not, that following the kind of the fiesta type pathology of COP26 reporting, that there then seems to be, a return to business as usual. We normally use this phrase in the context of thinking about economic relationships and processes that are fundamentally at root of this. But of course, it's journalism also is business as usual, as is academia too often, I'm sorry to say. And we all need to stand up, I think, and recognize the unprecedented nature of what's happening. So I would just make a plea, I think, that to see both journalists and groups within civil society as part and parcel of the same process. And we really need to be joining hands, I think, rather than acrimoniously trying to point fingers.
Do you know, Simon, I think that is a really fantastic and beautiful point in which to stop for a break. Can I just thank all of our speakers, Matt, Hannah, Leo, Megan, Nathan, John and Joelma. A really interesting session. I feel as if we could probably talk for very much longer, but unfortunately we have run out of time for today. If we could stop now maybe for 10 minutes, just give people a bit of a comfort break, grab a coffee, and we will come back for our second session, which is far more focused around journalism education and what journalism education can do to respond to some of the issues that we've discussed in this first session. So thank you everyone, fascinating, interesting discussions. I think that this is something that the Association for Journalism Education, and indeed most of us as journalists and journalism educators, will probably return to a great many times over, well, probably for forever now. So thank you so much. We will just blank the screen for 10 minutes and we'll return again at 3:10. Thank you.
Margaret, just before you do go,
go.
I'm very conscious of time in other parts of the world. Could I invite Amanda to go first? Amanda?
Yes, I've already emailed Amanda and suggested that to her.
Excellent,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you.
I'll just share my screen on that. I think that's correct. I just need to make it go from the...
Yeah, we've got it.
Wonderful. So do you just see the first slide or do you see the whole screen?
We can see we can see all of your slides. Well, we can see your slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll do it like, because I can manage it a bit easier then.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And I'll make that full size of that screen. One of the things that I find with climate change and the debate around it is, especially from students, is for them to be very, very clear about what global warming is and why such a small amount of warming is a problem. Now, if people, and it would be very easy to think, because we just hear these numbers of degrees is bandied around. Is it going to be 1 degree or 2 degrees? And it's very rare that the journalists will actually say what that is. And what it's not to do with, is it going to be 20 degrees today or 21? That's not what it's about. It's not air temperature in any place at any time. What it is to do with the entire temperature of the globe, and most specifically our climate drivers. So climatologists will talk about climate drivers. And when we look at the globe here, can you see me when I move my pointer around the screen?
Yeah, we can see that, yeah.
Yep, okay. If you can see around here, the Pacific Ocean here is a huge, vast heat sink. And if you imagine the amount of heat it takes to raise the water, say in an urn, from whatever the temperature is, the ambient temperature, to 100 degrees, it takes a fair bit of time and a fair bit of energy. When you try to imagine what that is like across the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, to raise the temperature of the Pacific Ocean by 1 degree is an absolutely vast amount of energy sunken into that ocean. And what we have done, what humanity has already done, is raised the temperature of that ocean by 1 degree. Now, why that is a problem, let me just go to the next slide. So when the oceans are roughly average temperature, 26 degrees is the average temperature of the ocean. And why we know this is that the ships that ply across the Pacific track across the equator. And so we have temperature records going back hundreds of years, because the temperature of the water coming into a steamship needed to be known, so you knew how much energy you needed to make steam. So we have lots of detailed temperature records, and you can see here that the temperature across the Pacific is roughly average. Now, what that does to the rainfall around the globe, you can see, if you just take a casual glance at that, it's looking pretty grey also. So when the ocean temperatures are pretty average, the effect on the global climate and weather is pretty average. You don't have much extreme. When we start to look at climate risk, what people look at, whether they're farmers or aviators or whatever they are, is climate risk. And climate risk comes when you have extremes of anything: extreme dry, extreme wet, extreme hot, extreme cold. So as you can see, when there's not a lot of variation and the ocean's roughly average, the climate is also average. But that's not what we've got when we have patches of hot water or patches of cold water that well up from the ocean and start to affect our global climate seesaw. So the seesaw of La Nina and El Nino are stretched across the Pacific, and it is only 2 degrees from average. So either 2 degrees cooler in the Pacific Ocean or 2 degrees warmer in the Pacific Ocean. And that, as you'll see in this presentation, makes a huge difference to the ocean temperatures and also the climate around the world. So this is a typical El Nino, which the Nino region is across here. And the Nino 1 region, which most specifically affects Australia, is where the international date line here meets the equator, so right about here. So when the ocean temperature there is only 2 degrees warmer than normal, the effect on Queensland's weather, where I am, is that instead of having our normal amount of rain, we have very depressed rainfall along the Great Barrier Reef. So that means that fresh water that would normally run out and feed our Great Barrier Reef, which we all know has got problems at the moment with coral bleaching, the reef goes pretty much the length of Queensland. And as you can see, if there's less rain, there's less nutrient running onto the reef. There's also, of course, effects on agriculture, etc. But the effect of it is not only restricted to Queensland, it's actually a global signal. So if you look at Queensland, when we have an El Nino, there are other places, all these ones with circles around the world, also have much less rain than normal. And there's a flip side for some other places. So some other places also have more extreme wet weather. And as you can see, there's not a heck of a lot of grey in that map, like in the other one that I showed you earlier. So instead of having fairly even climate patterns with no extremes, what we get is souped up weather everywhere. We get souped up droughts, souped up rain patterns and floods and catastrophes. And both of those are bad for any agricultural system and even aquaculture systems. So this is why 2 degrees of permanent warming would do this to the globe. So as you can see, the flow-on effect, if we were to have a bit of an open discussion, we could have a talk about what's going to happen to Australia's arable land, what's going to happen in South Africa, what's going to happen in South America, what's going to happen to North America, what's going to happen across the steeps of Russia over here. So it's all a bit sobering. The flip side of that is when we have a La Nina, which is a cold pattern of water across the ocean, and it's only 2 degrees cooler than normal, is enough to make the huge change. So the pattern across the Queensland coast is much higher rainfall probabilities. So these are not actually forecasts, rainfall forecasts, these are actually hindcasts. So the way the data is created is that the model of the ocean temperatures is interfaced with rainfall data from the past 120 years. And in years when there was a La Nina, this is what the rainfall pattern was like. Again, it doesn't apply just to Queensland. It actually has a signal around the world because the Pacific Ocean is such a big heat sink. So if you look again at the squares, which used to be circles in the previous map, so you can see that this is the opposite, this is the opposite, this is the opposite, this is the opposite. And likewise, all the areas that were before overly wet are now overly dry. And what I'll do is put these together so you can see that. So those are very strong signals that we get once we get 2 degrees warmer than normal. You can see that countries like Australia go from having the wettest types of years we ever have to the driest. And if we're at normal now and we've already gone up a degree, it means it's very difficult for us to ever get far enough down to ever get wet seasons in Australia. And if you know, Australia is one of the driest continents on Earth, and it's also the one with the most climate variability. So we've actually been seeing the effects of climate change for a long, long time. So I did a book on it in 1997 with the guy who found this pattern, this global pattern that's associated with the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is based on the temperature in the Pacific. So there is what this is used for in all sorts of areas is all sorts of businesses and governments use this information. There is a signal to major indices like the Chicago Wheat Exchange. He was asked for information to help with the Kosovo War to work out when it was going to be a good time to invade the place and not have climate risk for the armies going in there. There's all sorts of planning and even humanitarian preparations that can be done, because if you know, for example, that South America is going to have a drought, then you can actually prepare ahead of time, because these changes take about 6 months to come through. So if you're interested in getting information on this, it's our local Queensland long paddock. The long paddock is a term which is about used in the outback, where when farmers don't have enough feed for their stock, they turn them out onto the stock routes, which they call the long paddock, as opposed to the paddock in their back paddock. This is the website. It's a Queensland government's website. If you just Google long paddock, you will find this, and you will also see all the sea surface temperature maps going back in time. They have an archive going all the way back, and you can see what is happening at the moment, and you can see what is coming next. So This is the current one that I've just pulled up tonight to show you what is happening now. So there is a tongue of cool water coming across the Pacific, and that is giving Australia already La Nina conditions. And so everywhere around the world, as you saw, I'll just go back to that. So this type of pattern and forecast is what we're heading for over the next 6 months. So this, I think what's useful is that rather than run around like the little red hen saying the sky is falling, preparation is always the key. And what I've done in my reporting is talk to farmers about what is going to happen, and therefore what will they change. So if you're a farmer in Queensland and you know that we're going to have a good season, they have the preparation time, they will order twice as much seed, twice as much fertilizer, bigger tractor, and they will be able to take advantage of good season. Likewise, if they know they're coming up to a dry seasons, then they will be very conservative, or they will plant less, they will plant thinner, they will waste less fertilizer. They'll plant the bottom of their dams once the dams dry up and use that for a paddock. And so there are always going to be things that farmers can do to take advantage of whatever the season throws at them, and to minimize the risk when it's going to be problematic to their particular operation. So I would use this with journalism students, teaching them about how to report on climate change, is to really get down in the paddock with the farmers and explain to them their detailed climate forecast, and start to learn, what does this mean to a peanut farmer or a wheat farmer or a stock, someone who runs cattle or sheep, because being ahead of what is going to happen is always the way to make money on the land. And what I've seen over time is that the farmers who have used seasonal forecasting have been able to thrive despite the added droughts and the added floods. And they are the ones who've been able to buy out their neighbours. And the neighbours who just go day for day and imagine average are the ones who are forced off the land basically because they go broke. Because if you're not prepared for something like this, if you're not prepared to take the advantage of an extreme, or to be risk manage an extreme, then you very quickly go broke. The margins in farming are not there to be able to make very many mistakes at all. You only have to screw up a few times and you're out. You've lost your property.
I'm going to have, Amanda, I'm going to have to draw you to a close soon. I think the time's running on, but thank you.
Thank you.
Could you wind up? Yeah.
Let's be done. Thank
Brilliant.
you.
Amanda, thank you very much. I think throughout your presentation there, it was reminded of something I work with my students, and saying that good journalism isn't about making the complex over simple so people can understand it. It's about helping people to understand the complexities of life around us. And I think you've given us a exemplary example of just why that's so important. Thank you very much. Thank you. We now turn to Anna. Sorry, that wasn't meant to be a pun on your name, Anna. Anna Turns has worked in TV, radio, print journalism for 20 years. She's an experienced environmental journalist, and she's focusing on solutions. That's something we've heard from a number of our speakers tonight, on progress and innovation. She writes regularly for national publications here in Britain, such as The Guardian, The Telegraph, The Evening Standard, Coast, Positive News, and WikiLeaks. That's WikiLeaks, not WikiLeaks, WikiLeaks. And she also teaches journalism students at Plymouth Marjon. And if I could ask Dr. Shoshi from Malaysia to come in next and sort of shuffle the thing, because I'm conscious of the time in other parts of the world as well. So Anna, over to you. Thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much for having me. I have also got a little presentation, just a few slides, so I'm going to just try and share it and let me know if you can see it okay. Is that showing up for you?
Yep.
Okay, awesome. As you said, I do focus on solutions. I know climate is obviously a very tricky subject to cover, but it's not all doom and gloom. And I try and focus a lot of my work on constructive journalism, so looking at progress and innovation and the change makers who are doing really amazing things. And I try to bring that into a lot of the work I do with journalism students at Plymouth Marjon University. So I teach a range of modules to students who want to be news journalists and sports journalists and fashion journalists. It's a complete massive spectrum. But I try to bring environmental issues into everything, into all the conversations we have, to make it relevant. So I very much don't think that environment is a separate thing. It's integrated into everything. And I think that actually is a really good starting point to think of when we talk about having a framework to teach climate to journalist students. So I'm just going to run through these slides. So how can journalism education respond to the reporting of the climate crisis in a powerful and positive way? So it is about finding strong, meaningful ways of doing this. A lot of journalist students that I know can feel quite overwhelmed with this because it obviously is a very complicated thing and they're not necessarily scientists themselves. So I think we've got a real duty to arm people with the tools to be able to do this in whatever form of journalism they end up working in, because also I think it's going to be a much bigger subject. This is me. This is I'm an environmental journalist, as was said in the beginning. Some of the publications I write for, and I recently did a thing for BBC Radio 4 about toxic chemicals. But it is very much about translating complicated science into engaging, relatable stories. And that's what we are. We're storytellers. We're not scientists. We're not the experts. We are the people kind of bridging that gap. This wasn't really talked about when I studied 20 years ago. And I wish there had been kind of discussions about this back then, because I would have learned so much from it. And I do think now is a really pivotal time to enable this to grow in terms of climate journalism and people's education. There is so much scope for improvement, basically. We can only improve. And as I touched on just now, I do think those stories are relevant to every single genre and every single form of media, and that everyone does need a bit of a baseline in terms of the language that we use when we talk about climate, understanding what net zero is, being able to interpret things and understanding the bigger picture, so that there isn't the confusion that sometimes we see in newspapers and magazines, which I'll go into in a sec. So climate stories are unraveling at a rapid rate. As we heard before with the COP session, like there's just thousands of stories all the time, and it's kind of working out how to make sense of them all, I suppose, and enabling people to decipher them and to pick them apart and to work out how they're going to tell their own story as well. I do think there's a real thirst for stories like this that put normal stories in newspapers and magazines and online, but with a climate lens on them. I do think there's a real need for that. And I think we can't forget it. It's a bit like thinking, have I got a diverse mix of contributors? Have I put it in a climate context? It's just another question to maybe ask yourselves when we're producing content of any form, just to have that real consciousness of it, I suppose. And I think as educators, I think it's our job to make sure that people are climate literate by the time they leave university, and think in a holistic way. So I do think it's really important in terms of thinking about the language, the words we use, the headlines we choose, the pictures we use, who we're speaking to, which experts we're speaking to. Are we balancing opinion with fact, or are we balancing fact with other fact? And thinking about the ads as well. So Guardian made a conscious choice not to have any advertisers that had links to the fossil fuel industry, and that was quite a brave thing to do. Whereas sometimes you'll see news articles about the climate crisis next to an EasyJet advert. You just think, hang on a minute, where's the joined up thinking? It's just crazy. So, and that's essentially, it's an editorial decision. That's on the editor's shoulder. So it's just kind of weaving that into everything, I suppose. So yes, so it's having this joined up approach. So on the left, we've got one example of a page, I think it's in The Guardian, about drivers clashing with climate campaigners blocking the M25, something about oil drilling in the North Sea, and then something else about food shortages. And it's all just no one's talking to each other. Those different editorial teams are not linking anything. And there are all these issues that are kind of just very confused and not communicated in a very effective way. And that then filters through to the readers, and it's sending really confused messages. In a similar vein, this was on the Guardian website fairly recently. Primark plans more than 100 new stores worldwide. Obviously, like a fast fashion kind of king of the industry, next to a climate crisis story, and there's just no matching up, and that's the Guardian. So you think, if they're doing it, what hope have we got? So it's just kind of zooming out and thinking, does this sit well with the overall message that we're trying to spread? Not even spread, just trying to reflect, I suppose, because we're not making it up. So I'm working on developing some environmental journalism education tools, and I feel like we basically need to create a bit of a toolbox so that when people leave uni, they know what they're doing and they know where to refer to for more information. So there's a few different thoughts that I've written down, some of which I've mentioned in brief. So language, which we've mentioned a little bit earlier in the session, in terms of global warming, it sounds very, very gradual, very subtle. A lot of journalists now are talking about global heating. Climate change, also, it's quite gradual. Some publications are now talking about climate crisis, climate emergency, climate breakdown. It sounds a lot more immediate and punchy and current, and it's happening today. But it's the language we choose has a real impact in what happens in the reader's mind and how that connects with somebody, I think. Also, I think people as journalists have a duty to read through the greenwash as well. So whether that's through press release stuff, or whether that is people kind of coming out with little taglines in quotes, and then you're using that as a headline when actually they're just using a gimmicky word, or like just having that alertness to really see through that and being able to question it a little bit more and being able to dig beneath that. I mean, I see it a lot in products and all these claims from companies, and you think, how do they get away with it? And if it's already like on the shelves and in our homes and on the screens or whatever, it's very easy to then filter that into our journalism. And it's just having a real awareness of that and being able to question it, I suppose, and just have that real sort of curiosity about who's saying this claim, where's the proof of that, which is just part of rigorous reporting anyway, but I think it's very, very important in this context. Another thing I wanted to mention was resilience as well. So being a journalist, you do have to be very resilient, especially if you're a freelancer perhaps, and you do have to have that real growth mindset, which I don't think before university level is necessarily embedded in education. And I do think looking ahead to the coming decades, I think we all will have to be very, very adaptable and very resilient. And I think there's a certain level of understanding that we need to have, and we can share that with our students in terms of the need to be flexible and to kind of have that foresight, because things are going to change so quickly, and that can actually put them at an advantage in terms of their future careers if they've really got their fingers on the pulse. So I would say that would be a good thing to develop with them. An understanding of how to interpret the science. So Amanda kind of touched on this, and it's very much a translation. It's not dumbing down on the science. It's going to the core facts, and it's getting quotes from the right experts, but making it relatable, talking to the people on the ground, talking to the farmers, talking to the people being impacted, telling those stories and making it really human, because that is how we make it real and make it now. It's not about polar bears in 2050. It's about people all around the world right now. And I think it's just remembering that there's no point getting overwhelmed with facts and statistics. It's actually just about talking to people and finding out what's happening and what's the transformations are. There are some really amazing resources out there already. So there's something called Climate Reframe, which is a really good list of diverse contributors, diverse climate experts from around the world, and also Climate Visuals, who have just released a collection of 100 really amazing, beautiful, powerful photos, actually, that illustrate the climate, but they're not about polar bears sitting on melting icebergs. They're about farmers and renewable energy and innovators, and they're quite amazing images. And I think it's really good to be aware of how we can bring that into journalism in a positive way. That integrated approach is really, really key. So having discussions in every module about the environment, it's part of everything. Our whole lives depend on it. So whether we're coming at it from a finance perspective or politicians, or like however we're interviewing anybody about anything, it's just thinking, okay, how is that relevant, and encouraging students to have those conversations and just having an awareness of that, as I said before. So critical thinking, which is the crux of all good journalism, but not balancing, as we've kind of mentioned before, not balancing fact with climate denial. It's being really conscious of how we're doing that. And also, I just wanted to mention that it's quite, there's a debate to be had about the journalist's role and whether they have a duty to campaign and be an active part of environmentalism, or whether they are purely reporting. So I think that's a really interesting discussion to have with students, and possibly one to kind of throw to them and say, like, where is that line? Is it blurred? Is it really clear to you? Do we have a duty as journalists to be activists and to campaign for a better future and to hold power to account? Or is it just about reporting what the scientists say? And there's different answers to that. I'm not going to answer it now, but it's something to kind of flag up with students, I think, in the future. And also focusing on that solutions focused mindset. So it can be quite overwhelming and depressing and miserable, and it doesn't have to be. I'm an eternal optimist, and I do think that we can present this in a really empowering, positive way that makes them more employable when they leave university, and also it makes the content more inspiring as well and engages a wider audience, because actually if things are too miserable, people will switch off and they just won't engage in it at all. And we want people to be actively connecting with these stories so that stuff happens and people call for change and all of those things. So I think a solutions focused mindset will help massively in the coming years. And I will stop now because I think I've had my 10 minutes, but thank you so much. And I hope that's useful.
Anna, thank you. I am on. Yep, I'm not muted. Thank you very much for that. I think there's a lot to unpack there. There's some big takeaways, and I do like particularly your point about climate crisis informs all areas, all fields of journalism, and that's a really important one for me. And the point about joined up thinking and joined up critical thinking. Yes, and when you bring out your toolkit, can you please share it with us?
I will.
We look forward to that. Thank you. And now, Dr. Ngo Shi, a good follow-on from Anna's there, I think. Dr. Shi is a senior lecturer in the School of Communications at University Sans in Malaysia. She's published on feminism, on cinema, and multiculturalism in Malaysian screen culture. She's also co-editor of a UNESCO handbook on getting the message across, reporting the climate change and sustainable development in Asia and the Pacific. And that's a handbook for journalists. So I think that should also be migrating to all our reading lists. And again, that makes the point about that awareness of climate change and the cross-disciplinary approach. So thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for this opportunity to speak at this panel. It is an honor just to listen to all of you, because as you read out my, my very brief portfolio, I am actually a newcomer to journalism education, because I was trained in other area. And my name is Xiaoxi, and I'm a senior lecturer for the past 10 years at School of Communication, University Science, Malaysia. And as I listened to the few speakers from the first panel and their overwhelming kind of like personal experiences at COP26, it confirmed my feelings that the main challenge that we face in climate journalism is the level of indifference and also cold response to this important conversation, and also competition that is taking place at the global stage. So when it comes to the reporting of climate change, at the local and the national level, the amount of news coverage that we got was absolutely minimal. I think at most is 1 or 2 news throughout the whole COP26. So, and we are relying heavily to the Western media in general to get the climate news. So this fundamental lack of coverage on COP26 at the national level speak volumes to the problem. And my personal experience that I got involved rather late in the conversation of climate change as well, through UNESCO handbook entitled Getting the Message Across, reporting on climate change and sustainable development in Asia and the Pacific, which was published in 2018. This project was actually part of the UNESCO International Program for the Development of Communication on Journalism Education. And I guess because the project was funded by the Malaysian taxpayer through MFIT, and therefore I was invited to be on the editorial team. And the handbook has actually 2 objectives. First, to fill in the information gap that is mainly experienced in and by Asian and the Pacific countries. Second, to reinforce the capacity of journalists, journalism educators, and students in the region to understand the correlation between science and humanities when it comes to the reporting on sustainable development and climate change. But that was just a small step to a big gap in a global history of inequality. The major challenges I would like to touch upon is historically, due to the economic and technical constraint, there is an obvious lack of scientific research on climate change that we can access to, particularly information from the global south. Knowledge gap between the developed and developing nation is nothing new, but an old problem that has been persist. In the developing nations, it is hard to access to an up-to-date climate information that is particularly relevant and useful to the local context. So there's always a missing link between the local crisis to the global outlook of the climate science. So the ecosystem of news and restriction of funding in most part of the developing country are also major stumbling block to good investigative reporting on climate issues. Journalists in developing countries not only need to work under tight controls by their government, but also tight budget by media companies. So the double change ecosystem of news production complicates the agenda to push forward for a pro-climate news coverage to be in the foreground. So at the local level, many journalists chose to avoid employing critical media frames, which are at odds with the media system that is mainly controlled by the government and dominated by the corporate ownership and commercial imperatives. So maybe the lack of climate information is too weak the words to describe the fundamental challenges that facing journalism educators in the developing nations. As we want to equip our students to be able to monitor the governments in delivering their commitments for the nationally determined contributions, but we also need to make sure that our politicians not to be taken for a ride on the negotiation table. Fundamentally, the principle of climate justice needs to be well defined at all levels, and we can't rely on the source from, particularly from the developed nations, because issues related to deforestation, indigenous rights, digital gap, gender inequality, gender ethnic minority, health and infectious disease, and many more are very specific to the region. And on a side note, I would totally echo to and also agree with John's position on the principle of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Because this is the fundamental for us to talk about how do we move forward as a global nation to survive as a species. So a historical injustice must be put at the foreground by the mainstream media. And with that, so I believe the top priority as an educator at university is to empower our students to understand and to know the vocabulary of climate justice and localize it to communication with the different groups of the general public specific to the region. Is particularly important to bring about change at the ground level, positive change. So the challenge for us is not only to help build the intellectual capacity, but also to reinforce the moral capacity of our journalism students in order to tell the climate change story from the perspective of the most vulnerable and marginalized groups in the society. As a lecturer in a national university in Malaysia, I would like to also share a bit on the historical context of journalism education in the developing world in general, like Malaysia, because it's important for us to kind of like get a sense of, what's the why the ideological obsession with the narrowly defined notion of developmentalism or modernization. Because together with the expansion of European capitalism in the post-imperialist world, mainstream media in the third world countries play a key role to call for behavioral change among the traditional and indigenous community whose lifestyle were then a lot more sustainable than from the Earth's point of view. And it is within the discipline of developmental communication that the myth of modernization has been self-reinforcing and also locked the key stakeholders from the locals into embracing a modern, so-called modern lifestyle that promotes consumerism, that is premised on the greed of capitalists in the excessive exploitation of the nature as well as human capital. So while climate change and SDG is getting more attention in journalism application in Malaysia, it actually provides a self-reflective opportunity for the developing and for developing of the curricula to re-examine the dominant perspective of the narrowly defined idea of modernization. So that's the reason why when we see the reporting of COP26 suddenly turn into the mediated world, the mediated world that's fall back to the Cold War rivalry kind of like mentality. It sounds, it's almost like something very familiar to us, which makes us feel very powerless and also voiceless in this entire, kind of like big hoo-ha. So, however, I would like to also end my talk in a more positive note that while the so-called world leader at the top may disappoint us to bring about immediate structural change on the negotiation table, it is also crucial that I think change needs to be built patiently from below through positive collaboration, like today, in order to reach us across class, ethnic, gender, and national division to build a more just and nuanced approach to turn crisis into opportunity. And I believe only through more dialogues with people from different parts of the world, the human race will eventually be able to find and realize that to survive, we need to work collaboratively for a common good. And with that, as a way for me to show my solidarity to global citizens, I thank you for speaking up for the marginalized and poor and appreciate the opportunity to talk to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Shah.
I forgot to flip my slide. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I think you did us enormous service there by pointing out quite forcefully that journalism is a difficult thing to do in some places, and journalists face constraints that are political, that are commercial, that are from authoritarian organizations, and what they are doing in the face of that is remarkable. And I think that again, pointing out that it's the voices of the vulnerable, the voices of the marginalized, which need to be amplified, because they are the ones who know what's happening in their world on this. And the climate crisis is very much about climate justice and the wider aspects of justice and the implications there of capitalist and authoritarian and post-colonial systems. So thank you very much for that. There's a lot for us to think about. Really appreciate your contribution there. And next, if I can turn to Chris Patterson, Professor of Global Communication at the University of Leeds. And Chris has authored books about journalist safety, about international news, and created modules and taught on journalism ethics, on development communication and climate communication. He leads an African climate communications research project and is affiliated with the Priestley Centre for Climate. So thank you, Chris. I'm going to hand over to you.
Yes, thanks very much, David. I'm just trying to share my screen right now. Let's give it a go. Here it is. Sorry, do you have my screen there, David?
Yep.
Thanks very much. Well, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate it. I know it's late in the day, so I'll try to fly through the slides I have. I have to say there are many colleagues around the UK with a longer history of teaching about journalism and the environment than I have. I currently have the privilege of leading research on climate communication in 2 African countries, but also I'm trying to determine how to teach about climate to my own students with a new set of climate communications modules, which I've started here at Leeds. So these thoughts stem from those 2 activities. Let's just catch up with my notes. There are 4 topics I'll touch on as quickly as I can. The history of reporting climate change and its troubled nature, the efforts to write an alternative story, and a little bit on my work in the South in climate justice. And then finally, I'll wrap up with some thoughts on what universities are doing to integrate climate change into their teaching. I just show one of many excellent resources on the screen there, this book by colleagues of mine, but there's certainly many others for those people out there who would like to do more to teach journalism and climate change. As my Cardiff colleague Simon Cottle put it, who was on the call with us earlier, journalism for the first time is having to process crisis on a global level. And in fact, there are several global crises going on these days, as we well know. So that shift parallels a long and slow uptake in domestic news coverage of climate change. There were many campaigns in the 70s to get the media to pick up the story. And I have to say, of course, that my example here from the New York Times of the journalist Walter Sullivan pushing climate change onto the front page, I have to say that that's a very American example. Jeffrey Lean's earlier intervention obviously points out to us that he and other UK journalists were making this effort quite effectively in the 1970s. So, that extent of news coverage perhaps helped shift policy in the 80s and bring us the IPCC with all its subsequent influences. But it leaves us with a question of why wasn't climate change consistently the major global news story of the last 2 decades? And I'll just suggest some areas that we're probably all quite familiar with, the increasing polarization, for instance, which complicates straightforward reporting, the increasing uptake of a denialist or contrarian discourse, popular distrust of traditional journalism and the related rise in social media sources, and of course the complexity and negativity of the story work against climate reporting. But one thing that I think it's absolutely vital that we point out, and some of the other speakers have made this this point as well, that we point out to our students, are that there are numerous efforts out there to limit or alter reporting on climate and on global warming. People in this seminar will certainly understand these processes well, but I want to emphasize how crucial it is to make our students familiar with them. The enormous money behind greenwash and all the foundations, particularly centered in the United States, that try to shape policy and media coverage. The threat of false balance. We spoke earlier about the BBC finally fighting back on its internal tendency towards false balance, but not really until 2017 in terms of internally putting that message out to its journalists. But arguably, there are other aspects of journalism that have contributed, for instance, a suspicion of environmental campaigning as inherently anti-establishment. I think it's useful to put to students the idea of that we don't really ask for this kind of balance in any other scientific topics. You know, Saturn's rings are made mostly of ice. How many people here would disagree? If we were producing a radio show, should we find someone who disagrees so we get an alternative view? And that's such a strange idea, but students won't tend to reflect on it unless you put it in those terms. Finally, the political project of sowing doubt and confusion, I think, really has to be brought to the attention of students. And I find this quote quite helpful from the very influential American Republican strategist, communications strategist, Frank Lutz, telling the Republican Party in 2002 that should the public come to believe that scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you must continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in debates. Efforts to confuse public opinion certainly have continued at pace for 20 years. Here's an advertorial from the New York Times from 2000, but it's not difficult to find similar corporate interventions still going on today. This is what our young journalists going into climate reporting are up against. This kind of money, I'm certainly not going to detail the slides, but it's a set of examples from CNBC in the US of the kind of money that's poured primarily by the energy conglomerates into the front organizations, which then try to shape public policy and try to shape journalism. That's a lot for journalists to go up against. So what kinds of journalism work? There have been many wonderful examples in the seminar today. This is one I use. Take one example from my teaching. Here's some academic research that manages to teach an effective climate journalism, to teach about effective climate journalism, to critique environmental journalism, and also to say something about the psychology of public engagement with climate change action. It's certainly an approach in terms of humanizing the story that resonates with what Hannah McLeish was saying earlier. The author of this research argued that when the climate protester known as Swampy became a celebrity, with sympathetic treatment in the media for a short while, protests in general were normalized, and the trope of portraying protesters as violent and deranged didn't work anymore. their objectives went from disruptive to idealistic and legitimate. Now, Swampy is actually back in the news in the UK this month, so we might ask our students if the same effect is happening. My ongoing experience of conducting climate research in Ghana and Kenya also has given me some neat opportunities to introduce UK students to global climate justice issues, drawing from recent direct experiences and examples from the research I've been doing. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but to be able to bring examples of the lives of women agriculturalists in these countries and talk about the challenges they face with students really makes the situation for developing countries a bit more real for our future climate journalists. I would also just suggest briefly that part of the integration of climate justice with climate journalism needs to include a critical decolonial stance. So in this case, I asked students to examine a typical bit of messaging from a British charity, the kind of messaging that's deployed to influence climate journalists. I want them to understand both the messaging strategy, but also its colonial qualities. These are just some observations from another small study I did with a Kenyan colleague about news coverage of climate in Kenya. And essentially the point being that it struggles. Newsrooms in Africa struggle generally to cover the climate. News about climate change adaptation is not necessarily profitable. People with money are in the cities in Africa, and they're the audience, and they're better protected. So editors don't tend to see it as the story. Specialized science and climate reporting is rare in Kenya, but many media outlets are increasingly trying. My broad point would be that we can also play a role in supporting journalists in the global South to do climate journalism. Oops, just jumped ahead there. Just to wrap up then, I wanted to mention that there are efforts underway to embed climate change teaching right across the curriculum in higher education, and journalism teaching, I think, needs to be out front with this. Colleagues from our Priestley Climate Center here at Leeds are involved with an effort across 80 institutions to mainstream climate change education in UK universities. And there's some very interesting recommendations in this document. So this is a report they prepared for COP, and it's available at the COP website. These are all, it was a selection of the many institutions that were involved in putting that together. So I will wrap up now. I will just suggest that climate change reporting seems much more mainstream now, as many others in this panel have suggested. But is that just an effect of the new US engagement with climate or of COP? There are anyway lots of examples of new journalistic approaches and collective commitment, and there's a lot to talk about in teaching about climate journalism now. My big message is that we can and we should embed climate change in journalism teaching, and there are plenty of resources out there to help. Some of them have been shared in the chat here. I'm happy to share some of the things I've gathered up. There's also plenty of student demand for climate communication teaching. As I said to my school in selling my new modules, all of our students will be climate communicators, no matter the communication specialty that they end up going into. That is it for me. Thanks very much for the chance to talk to you.
Chris, thank you very much. I think you've picked up and developed some of the critical themes that have been emerging throughout the this conference today. I think that's important and highlighted in particular, I think, the climate justice and the pushback, the powerful forces that are in play, and how that power is being deployed covertly and overtly, and the importance that's also Dr. Shoshi pointed out about taking this from a global and a local perspective, and being attuned to the colonial influences that are still out there. Thank you very much. Thank you. And now I turn to Mark Noozle. Mark, a particular pleasure for me because we met, I don't know if you remember, at the World Journalism Education Congress in Paris when we were both from the syndicate that Agnes Gouliash led on preparing journalism students for the mobile world.
I remember.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you very much. It's a delight to see you again.
You too.
Even if not in person, unfortunately. But there we go. Mark is a professor and chair of the Department of Emerging Media at the University of St. Thomas, Minnesota. He's the author, co-author, and editor of 8 books, mostly on environmental themes. And he is also a frequent writer and speaker on environmental issues. So it is a pleasure to welcome you today. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. I'll share my screen. Oh dear, let's see here. Let's see if this works. I just installed a new operating system, so I want to do that. Share is what I want to do.
That's working.
There we go. Okay. Now let's get up here and go slideshow and go play from the start. Now we should be in good shape.
That's it.
So I'm speaking to you from Rome. So if you hear the typical sirens of the Rome ambulances in the background and then the honking of horns as the people don't get out of the way for the ambulances, that's what's happening. It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you very much for inviting me and seeing some familiar faces as well. I'm Mark Noozle. I'm teaching at the University of St. Thomas in Minnesota, currently on assignment in Italy, teaching students here. So a little bit of background. For those of you not from the US, which I guess is everybody, St. Thomas is a mid-sized private school in Minneapolis and St. Paul, 10,000 students. My department has all undergraduates, approximately 175 undergraduate students, somewhere between there and 200. We teach journalism, digital media arts, and strategic communication. You can see my background there. And as I mentioned, I'm working here in Italy at the moment, teaching and doing some research here. So in talking about journalism, education, and climate change, there's been several fantastic suggestions so far. And was delighted to hear Chris Patterson talk, somebody I've admired for a while in terms of his work. And I wanted to mention a couple of things that we do, that I've done over the years at St. Thomas and elsewhere where I've taught to train students to cover climate change. And I'll take it down to the basics. And this is just real simplified stuff, but it might help folks think about it in a slightly different way. I always want students to think about where they're working, what medium they're working for. And for example, if you're working for television, what's the visual story? If you're working for magazines, you've got room for more complicated stories to be told. And if you're working for an online site or a newspaper, congratulate yourself, first of all, if you're working for a newspaper. And then consider how much climate change affects what you're writing about it and how it is a variable in the story that you are working on. We've got a general rule at our institution among those that teach, as I mentioned, those that teach the subjects that I've just talked about, where anybody that turns in a story of a text version of a story has to include a visual element in it. And we drill that in them from the moment they step on campus, so that by the time they're 19 years old, they wouldn't dream of just giving me words. They have to give me pictures. That can be video, that can be still photographs. At the moment, I've got students with sketchbooks walking around Italy doing their own drawings in the tradition of Da Vinci and Michelangelo, but they've got to turn in a visual element with every story, and I'll explain why in a moment. The other thing I wanted to mention too is that, and this is a part of the research that I've done over the years, dating back 25 years now, is to try and get the students to understand the historical perspective of climate change and human impact on the environment. And they're very surprised to hear that this is not something that just popped up 10 years ago, that there's a long history of the discussion of this. And in Italy in particular, the Italian ambassador, George Perkins Marsh, wrote about climate change in a sense, he didn't use those terms, of course, but he talked about humans and their impact on nature in a long-term sense in a book published way back in 1862 when he was ambassador here in Rome. So we try to get them to think about the historical perspective and go back as far as it's appropriate. And then it's been pointed out several times, of course, that you've got to include a range of voices in your stories. And it helps with the diversity issue, it helps with the inclusivity issue. And one of the ways that we get students to think about that, and I think I see this getting better over the course of global coverage, is not just to talk to the scientists. And there's nothing against the scientists. And of course, they're doing important work. And of course, they have to be quoted. And of course, they have to be sources. But they don't have to be the only ones. They shouldn't be the only ones, as a matter of fact. And it's been mentioned already. Politicians and government industry sources in the very same way. They can be experts and you can use them as experts. So what we are teaching right now is to try to divide sources up into at least two categories, experts and characters, to get the students to think about, have they got diverse voices in their stories? So the experts, as I've mentioned, are the scientists, are the politicians, sometimes government or industry sources, but the characters, those are that should be the meat of your story. Those are the everyday people who are affected by climate change. And I think they're the most often overlooked group, although I think the situation actually is improving here. You want to talk to the fishermen, to the farmers, people who are closest to the land to find out about how climate change is affecting them. And that was pointed out very dramatically by our friend from Australia a little bit ago. This fellow, for example, is a fisherman on the Adriatic coast. Now, he's not going to show up in hardly anybody's stories on climate change, but yet he should. His business as a fisherman has been affected as much as anyone's. And that's the kind of person, he's got strong views on it. And that's the kind of person that you need to talk to. So one of the ways we get students to start out is to ask them to think small. Now, of course, we've just finished with COP26. We've heard from several of the journalists who have been there. It's a huge story. It's an important story. And of course, there's going to be 3,000 students or 3,000 journalists that are covering it. But my students in their first job and their second job are probably not going to be in that group. But they will be at media markets in the Midwestern United States. Maybe we've got some from Canada and so forth. And they need to think about this story in terms of size, and it needs to be small. So I talk to them about thinking small, thinking about the local level, thinking about neighborhoods, thinking about families. And we've heard the example of the farm family, and that's a great example. They have that experience with climate. Now, I'm originally from Iowa in the American Midwest, from a long line of farmers. So I have a prejudice in this area, but nobody knows the land better than a farmer. And nobody pays more attention to the climate and to the weather, which are separate, of course, but nobody pays more attention to that than the farmer. And all the farmers that I know, and the men and women that I grew up with, of course, are experiencing climate change. I often use the data point now that I live in Minnesota, which borders Canada, that since 1980, the average length of the growing season in Minnesota has improved 11 days. And that might not seem like much, but think about that. Almost 2 extra weeks of growing season now in Minnesota due to rising temperatures. That's an important point, and farmers know that. It affects their planting, it affects their application of fertilizer, their application of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides. It affects their cultivation and also affects their long-term market planning for that matter. So those are important ways, and those are ways that students can think about it. I also want to make the point that many routine stories, and by routine stories, I'm thinking about breaking news maybe, or news that is not necessarily long-term or deeply investigative, but news stories that have some impact. For example, in Minnesota this summer, we had a very large series of wildfires, in the top 4 or 5 wildfires in state history, at least in recorded history. And of course, those stories had to be covered as breaking news every day. How close were the fires to the people? How close were they to buildings? How much in danger were the firefighters? And so on and so on. And I was tweeting those stories, and I took some photographs. And the trick is, of course, to step back from the daily coverage and to figure out, is there a climate change angle to this? And when is it appropriate to write about? And when is it appropriate to publish or to put up on the website and so on? And that takes a little work. So finally, and I know I'm standing in the way of happy hour for many of us, so I will be quick. Climate change is, of course, a complicated subject, and it takes years to master it. And I still haven't mastered it, and I've been looking at it for 30 years. But you've got to be a lifelong learner, which is what we stress to the students. Education never stops. Learning is continuous. Keep educating yourself. Keep working at it. And I want to put a pitch in. We have not heard this yet, and I think this would be a good time to put the pitch in, is to take advantage of those professional organizations to make connections with the other journalists who are working on this issue, both student and professional. Build your social networks. I'm a big believer on the US side in the Society of Environmental Journalists. I was on their board for 8 years, edited their journal, and that's where I send my students. But any of these professional organizations that you've got to make connections with other journalists, that support system, that social network is really important, really important. And then, of course, the last thing I tell the students is to read. I don't know if the other professors in this panel have this experience, but one of the things that distresses me most is when I encounter a young first-year or second-year student who doesn't read very much. And it's one of the things I try to emphasize to them the most is just read everything you can. So thank you. I'll end it there. I'll turn it back, stop sharing, give it back to David. Thank you, David.
Mark, thank you. I love that note you finished on there. Yes, I think everyone who's watching this will probably be clapping along with you and saying, yes, read, just read. And also your stress on the importance of images. I've just been taking a seminar last week on how we read images and how important they are in understanding the world and in shaping our understanding. So I was delighted at that. And of course, the importance of a diversity and range of voices and sources, and think small. I mean, my special field, I think, is in journalism in communities, and there were so many resonances there. Thank you. And thank you, everybody. I think there's been so many resonances right across these 2 panels and within the panels today. That's been as you like to be part of this. Thank you so much. I'll pass you over to Margaret and to the other Chris, Professor Chris. Yes.
Could I just ask some of the panelists in this session, and I don't know who'd want to answer it, but I'm really struck that teaching climate change communication really requires interdisciplinarity in the context of teaching, and really would require us to be reaching out beyond perhaps our own departments and our own specialisms. For the people who are teaching it, do you regularly have colleagues who are maybe from a scientific or environmental science background in your own institutions actually participating in your teaching of the topic?
I could say it bit of that about that quickly, Margaret. Yeah, absolutely. We're really privileged here at Leeds to have the Priestley Center and some of the IPCC scientists right here on campus. Now, I can't get them in to talk to my class, but I could certainly get some of the younger colleagues who work with them. And when I started this module I referred to last year, that was one of the first things we did, was to have one of the climate scientists come from across the campus and just talk through at a fairly basic level what the science is, which is, I think, really vital for media students who might not have engaged with that aspect of it at all before. And it personalizes the research. It gives them the chance to say, this is why this is so important to me. This is, this is why I'm, digging for soil cores and that kind of thing. And that gives young journalists something to think about, how to get a handle on that.
Because it seems to me that that's really, I think, a lot of the thread that's running through a lot of what the speakers in both the panels this afternoon have been saying is about that sense of knowing what you're talking about and understanding what you're talking about. And it would seem to me that that's really what we need to do as well as journalism educators, is reach out to those people who have that knowledge. So thank you, that's really great.
If I could interject, Margaret, I take it in the other direction. Instead of begging the scientists to come to my class, I go to theirs and elbow my way in if necessary. And in fact, taught for 5 years a course in our environmental studies program, just because it had to be done. And that's another way to approach it, is if they won't come to you, you go to them. We do have a kind of a crazy one set up for spring semester. I don't know how it will work, and I'll report back to you, good or bad. I am team teaching a course on this subject with a philosopher.
Wow.
A Buddhist philosopher. And I have no idea how this is going to turn out. The only thing I can tell you is that it's open only to honors students. So they'll be quite bright and they'll see right through it if we make a hash of it. But on the other hand, it could be something great. So perhaps the lessons of the Buddha can help us with
well, that sounds please do report back to us. I was really struck, I think it was Anna who used the term climate literacy, and I think that's certainly something that I'm going to be thinking about in terms of my own climate literacy and how I can share that with the students. So lots to think about. Thank you. Can I thank everybody who's been in this panel? I know that the afternoon has gone on, and I do apologise. And I said at the start, we have a grand old tradition, the AJE, of running over, and we always aspire not to run over, and unfortunately we haven't achieved that today. But I think for me, this is just one of the most important subjects we can be talking about at the moment. So I really want to thank everybody for their contributions. We are actually, the World Journalism Education Council is holding its first fully online conference next July, and AJE UK have been charged with running a session on climate change reporting. So I would say to some of our speakers today that David and I may well be in touch to see if you would like to contribute to that, because I think that would also be a really exciting project to be involved in. And certainly I think some amazing things have been said today, and we've just had fantastic contributions. Just before we close, and I know we don't have as many people here, and I know that our next two speakers were probably wishing that I let them speak at the top of the panel. But our journal editor, Professor Chris Frost, wants to say a few words, as does Simon Cottle from Cardiff. And I think probably what I need to offer both Chris and Simon is, if they also send me something in writing, I will send it round our membership to make sure that the message gets to everyone rather than just the few of us that are left at this late time on a Friday afternoon. Chris, do you want to go first, and then we can hear from Simon?
Yes, thanks very much, Margaret. I just want to do my usual sort of pitch that we need articles for the journal. I know that people have been fantastically busy in the very difficult circumstances of teaching over the last year or nearly 2 years, which means that research has perhaps taken a bit more of a backseat than would normally be the case. But do send us your papers, but particularly presentations from the session today. You can either send a full paper that you want to have refereed, about 6,000 to 8,000 words. It is our usual length, or a slightly punchier, shorter one, which might fit much better with what people have been doing today, which is looking at the sort of conference proceedings, but also comment criticism, which can be anything from about 2,000 to around 4,000 words. We wouldn't referee those, particularly if they've come from today, as you've presented them to people who've had a chance to critique those. Also looking for book reviews, and if you read a good book in the last year or so that you'd like to write a review about, please do that. You can contact me, or you can contact Tor Clark, our reviews editor. But also, if you've written a good book and that's been published or about to be published, then of course that's a fantastic achievement, and we want to make the most of that. Let me know about it, and we can help promote that in the journal. So the address is ajejournal@gmail.com, or you can contact me direct if you want to talk about something or to discuss it at profcfrost@gmail.com. So ajejournal@gmail or profcfrost@gmail. Deadlines, I really need to get stuff for the next edition, which would be spring. The sort of Christmas edition is more or less sorted out, so I would need stuff by February, but please let me know if you've got something in the pipeline. And for our summer edition, in July. But I'll send you some details, Margaret, so we can send it round. So sorry to keep you guys when tea and drinks are calling, but I need the promotion.
No, thank you, Chris. As always, we will do our best to encourage people to contribute to our journal. Thank you. And Simon, you've got a really interesting proposition for people.
Well, I hope so, Margaret, and thank you for letting me make my pitch. It was a coincidence, really. I was just putting out a call for an extension of my series of books, which I've been editing for Peter Lang for, I don't know, 10 years or so now. And the series is called Global Crises and the Media. And there's been about 25, I think, titles published, where we've looked at a number of the world's most pressing crises, and I used to write, and still do, I suppose, about global crises. And I think colleagues sometimes found it difficult to make the imaginary leap to understand that we do live in one world, that we share a planet, and that these problems very often are collective, and as the speaker said earlier on, requires a transnational and cooperative response. My own thinking now is that actually even that term, global crises, has become, unfortunately, out of date, and I'm starting to write about a world in crisis. And what I mean by that is that the crises that are pressing on humanity, climate change is of course huge within that, but there are many other crises now that are interlocking and interpenetrating. If we think about the sixth mass extinction, we think about biodiversity loss, we can think about a whole range of other pressing issues. Water, food, energy insecurity are now going to be part of our planet, as will no doubt increased population movements and conflict. And these and other types of phenomena, I would argue, are expressive of and are now embedded or endemic to the state of the world that we live in. So even climate change has to be understood, I think, in relation to other forms of crises. I haven't even mentioned the pandemic, of course, COVID-19. Many people would argue, including the World Health Organization, that that was most probably a zoonotic disease engendered in part through humans breaking relationship with nature. So increased wildlife trade, the production of monocultural agriculture, and so on, produces a situation where zoonotic diseases, diseases that can jump species, are now more prevalent than they have ever been in the past. All of these things then are part of a world in crisis. I could go on and I won't, it's too depressing, isn't it, on a Friday afternoon, but I would like to see more books being commissioned in academia. I feel that academia isn't really, in my field, media and journalism studies, isn't really stepping up to the plate of what's required yet. And I also think, notwithstanding some amazing journalism, that journalism also has such an important role to play in all these types of processes, that we also need to have increased scrutiny and also increased positive responses to journalism, encouraging journalism to go deeper and better in its reporting. And for me, it was really wonderful to hear some amazing arguments this afternoon. So my series then is looking for books. It has published books in the past which fruitfully combine both academic and professional and practitioner perspectives, and I would like to see that encouraged. And I could well see a volume, maybe an edited volume or a sole authored volume, exploring you know, the educational nature of journalism communications and how it can be improved. But as I say, I would welcome any books on any topic that are dealing with the world in crisis or some important facet of that. So too many words from me late on Friday afternoon, but thank you for listening, and thank you, Margaret, for letting me put that to your panel. It would be great if you could circulate something.
Yes, I will, because you did send me some words, so I will circulate that next week to our membership. So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Simon, and can also just thank all of our speakers this afternoon. I think it's been a really interesting discussion. I think we probably all have gone away with lots of stuff to think about, and to the very small gathering that we have left, our next event, this is our final event of 2021. I think this is probably about our 9th online conference. We've become quite adept at it. And it has enabled us to hear from colleagues across the globe, and that has been one of the benefits of the pandemic. We have our next conference on January the 12th, and we will send information out about that to our members. So if I could just thank everyone, thank you to those who've stayed on to the end. Thank you particularly to those who haven't attended an AJE event before, and we've had lots of people here today who haven't. So hopefully your experience means you may come back another time. Thank you. Have a really good evening and have a really good weekend. And let me be the first to also maybe say, have a really good Christmas break too. Thanks very much. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Particularly to people in really nice locations like Rome and places like that. Quite envious. Thank you so much. And then there were 3, and then there were 4. Ivana, well done on the translation.
That was brilliant.
That was brilliant.
I was worried that it would not really work, but I
think it did. I think it worked well. I think it worked really